Morty Smith spends most of Rick and Morty looking nervous, outmatched, and one bad decision away from disaster. Yet years beside Rick have also taught him how to read danger, use impossible technology, manipulate systems, and sometimes understand Rick better than Rick expects. In this video, we break down every time Morty was a genius. Section 1. Morty knows drunk Rick better than anyone. Vindicators 3. The Return of World Ender. Morty usually enters Rick's adventures expecting his grandfather to understand the dangerous parts, even when Rick is also the person making everything less safe. The Vindicators flip that arrangement after Rick gets blackout drunk and turns a superhero mission into a deadly game built around his own habits. This is the story of how Morty's years beside Rick begin giving him answers that experienced heroes cannot find for themselves. Vindicators 3, The Return of World Ender, aired on August 13, 2017, during the third season of Rick and Morty. The story begins when the Vindicators send out another call for help, and Morty immediately wants to answer it. He admires the team, while Rick sees them as shallow heroes who enjoy praise for doing work he considers simple. Morty reminds Rick about their agreement that Morty can choose one out of every 10 adventures, which forces Rick to go along even though he clearly has no respect for the people they are joining. That difference matters before the real danger even begins because Morty wants the mission to feel important. He is excited to work beside Vance Maximus, Supernova, Alan Rails, Crocubot, Million Ants, and the rest of the team, while Rick spends the briefing insulting them and drinking. The Vindicators also reveal that Rick and Morty were deliberately left out of the previous Vindicator mission because the group found Rick difficult to work with. Morty is embarrassed because he can already tell Rick probably gave them a reason to make that choice. Rick takes the rejection personally, even while pretending the group means nothing to him, and he shows more warmth toward Noob Noob because Noob Noob laughs at his jokes and cleans up after him. Morty watches Rick behave badly around people he wants to impress, which places him in a familiar position. He is trying to manage an adventure and Rick's personality at the same time. The next morning changes the entire mission. Rick wakes up badly hungover with little memory of what happened after the briefing, and the team heads to World Ender's base expecting a major confrontation. Instead, they find World Ender and his forces already dead. Rick killed the villain during his blackout, which should have ended the mission, but drunk Rick decided that the superheroes themselves were a more interesting target than the enemy everyone had come to fight. A recording from the previous night reveals that Rick built a series of deadly games for the Vindicators. The group is now trapped inside a course designed by someone who dislikes them, knows how to build lethal technology, and was too drunk to remember any of it by morning. Sober Rick can recognize parts of his own thinking, but he cannot simply explain every trap because the person who created them exists in a stretch of time he barely remembers. Morty begins to matter in a way none of the Vindicators expected because the heroes know combat and teamwork, while Morty knows what Rick sounds like after too much alcohol. He has heard the repeated rants, watched Rick become fixated on strange subjects, and learned how his grandfather's thinking changes when he is drunk. The knowledge looks useless until the entire room is controlled by puzzles created during one of those nights. The first traps encourage the Vindicators to analyze themselves and one another, and the team starts arguing over whose flaws fit the clues. Morty realizes that drunk Rick is less interested in carefully separating their personalities than the heroes assume. Several supposedly unique flaws can apply to the entire team because Rick's opinion of the Vindicators is broad, hostile, and much less thoughtful than the superheroes want the game to be. That becomes the first clear pattern. The Vindicators keep trying to solve the traps as if the person behind them built a fair test, while Morty solves them by asking what drunk Rick would actually think. The difference gives a 14-year-old without powers a useful advantage over people who look far more qualified. Morty is studying the author of the puzzle instead of trusting the puzzle to explain itself. He also has an advantage none of the heroes can reproduce quickly because his knowledge comes from repeated exposure rather than from information available in the room. The Vindicators can inspect the clue, debate it, and compare their abilities, but they cannot recreate years of hearing Rick complain, drink, forget, and repeat himself. Morty can. Vance Maximus refuses to keep playing by Rick's rules and tries to leave, but the decision ends badly and proves that the game is capable of killing people the story has presented as serious superheroes. The danger becomes more immediate after Vance's death because nobody can dismiss Rick's creation as a humiliating prank anymore. Morty has to keep following the logic of someone whose behavior he knows well, while the Vindicators become increasingly angry at the person standing beside them who cannot even remember building the course. The team's internal problems also begin surfacing. Old resentment involving Supernova, Alan Rails, and Million Ants turns the group against itself. Rick clearly wanted to expose the contradictions behind their heroic image, and the traps keep placing them under enough pressure for those contradictions to become destructive. Morty entered the mission as the person most eager to believe in the Vindicators, but admiration becomes less useful every time another member lets pride or resentment distract from the immediate problem. One clue points toward a subject that feels strangely specific beside the superhero setting, and Morty connects it to Israel because he remembers that Rick tends to rant about Israel when he is blackout drunk. The answer sounds ridiculous until it works, and that success reveals how unusual Morty's knowledge has become. He is not decoding an alien language or performing advanced mathematics. He is recognizing the repeated subjects that appear when Rick becomes the version of himself he cannot remember the next morning. That kind of memory becomes valuable because Rick's blackout creates a gap in Rick's own knowledge. Sober Rick can inspect what he built and make guesses based on his personality, but Morty remembers what it is like to stand near him during nights that disappear from Rick's memory. In those moments, Morty becomes a living record of patterns Rick himself has lost. The grandson, who usually knows less about the science, sometimes knows more about the behavior that produced the science. The Vindicators continue falling apart as the game moves forward, and each death removes another person who appeared stronger and more capable than Morty when the mission started. Morty's advantage also grows because the traps reward memory more than status. The Vindicators enter with combat experience, special abilities, and confidence built from surviving their own missions, yet none of that helps them predict a drunken scientist they barely know. Morty has the opposite profile. He lacks their power, but he has spent enough nights around Rick to recognize recurring obsessions, careless construction, and the kind of logic Rick repeats when his judgment disappears. In this room, that narrow experience becomes expertise no one else has. Morty is still physically weaker than the people around him, yet he keeps surviving because he understands the variable controlling the entire environment better than they do. The clearest example arrives when the group discovers that one of Rick's homemade neutrino bombs has become part of the game. A device capable of causing enormous destruction might look like the point where Morty's experience finally stops being useful. Instead, Morty reacts with the exhausted familiarity of someone who has already been forced to deal with this kind of crisis more than once. The pilot had already shown Rick drunkenly preparing a neutrino bomb while Morty panicked beside him. By the time of Vindicators 3, Morty has apparently faced enough similar situations that trying to deal with one of Rick's drunken bombs has become part of his experience. He understands that Rick's construction can be unreliable when alcohol is involved, and he knows enough about the pattern to take the problem seriously without freezing. Rick is surprised by how routine the situation has become for Morty, which quietly reveals something ugly about the years they have spent together. Morty did not receive a safe lesson in bomb disposal. He learned because Rick kept creating dangerous situations that someone else had to survive the next morning. Every repeated disaster forced Morty to remember what worked, what failed, and what kinds of mistakes a drunk Rick was likely to make. The scene is the strongest genius moment in the section because Morty's knowledge was earned in the worst possible classroom. He is dealing with a device powerful enough to kill everyone nearby, and the reason he can even attempt the job is that Rick has repeatedly exposed him to similar danger. The bomb turns the pattern recognition from the earlier clues into something physical. Morty's memory is no longer helping him solve a riddle. It is helping him stay alive around one of Rick's most dangerous habits. The moment still needs an important limit because Morty does not suddenly demonstrate that he understands neutrino physics better than Rick, and he never claims he could design the bomb himself. His intelligence remains practical. He knows enough about Rick's construction, drunken carelessness, and previous failures to approach the device with experience. That is a much narrower claim than calling him a hidden super scientist, but it is also much better supported by what the episode shows. Morty's advantage can be understood as survival knowledge built through repetition. Rick possesses the ability to create impossible technology, while Morty is often the person forced to deal with the gap between what Rick can build and how irresponsibly Rick sometimes uses that ability. Years inside that gap have taught Morty skills no normal teenager would have any reason to develop. The final challenge prevents the episode from pretending Morty understands every part of his grandfather because drunk Rick's recording asks the surviving Vindicators to identify the one person he actually values. Morty has spent most of the game correctly reading Rick's habits and has reason to believe he may know the answer. The situation also touches something Morty has wanted for years because being important to Rick matters to him in a way he often tries to hide. Morty steps into the final test, expecting that Rick's hidden affection may point toward him, but the recording reveals that drunk Rick was talking about Noob, the person who laughed at Rick's jokes and cleaned up after him during the briefing. Morty's success at decoding Rick's practical behavior suddenly reaches a boundary. He can recognize the shape of a rant and the weakness of a bomb, yet he can still misunderstand where Rick's affection is directed in a specific moment. That failure gives the section a useful ending because it keeps Morty's intelligence from becoming too clean. He knows Rick well enough to survive him, while still wanting emotional reassurance badly enough to see it where it is not. The episode lets both things be true. Morty can be highly observant about Rick's habits and still remain uncertain about what Rick feels. The Vindicators themselves have largely destroyed one another by the end of the story. World Ender barely matters after the opening because Rick killed him before the official mission began. The superheroes Morty admired spend the rest of the episode panicking, fighting, betraying one another, and trying to survive Rick's test. Morty's idea of them changes because he has to respond to what they actually do instead of protecting the image he brought into the mission. He begins as the biggest fan in the room and still changes his behavior when the evidence stops matching the fantasy. That adjustment is another quiet sign of Morty's practical intelligence. Admiration does not keep him loyal to bad decisions. He becomes more interested in opening the next door and stopping the next trap than in preserving the idea that the Vindicators are heroes who must know what they are doing. Rick's blackout also gives Morty an unusual role inside their partnership. Rick creates a dangerous problem and forgets it, while Morty remembers because the consequences remain real for him even when Rick's memory disappears. Over time, that makes Morty the person carrying continuity across disasters Rick can treat like isolated mistakes. The neutrino bomb is the best object to leave behind because it captures the entire pattern in one image. Rick can build something catastrophic during a drunken night and barely remember the event. Morty remembers the danger, the uncertainty, and the fact that one of those bombs may not work the way Rick intended. By Season 3, living through Rick's carelessness has already become a form of training. Morty does not leave the base stronger than the surviving heroes, and he never becomes the scientist who created the technology around them. He leaves with evidence that repeated danger has turned observation into skill. The Noob reveal keeps one final limit in place because Morty can read Rick's habits while still misreading Rick's heart. He gets better at understanding how Rick operates long before he gains any certainty about what he means to Rick, and that difference allows Morty's intelligence to grow without removing the insecurity that keeps him recognizably Morty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty survives Rick's drunken traps by recognizing the man behind them, but knowing Rick's habits only goes so far when Rick is somewhere else and one of his machines is already changing Summer's body. Morty then has to learn something harder than Rick's behavior, enough of Rick's technology to fix what the family has broken. Section 2. Morty learns how to use Rick's technology without him, the Whirly-Durly conspiracy. Rick's garage is filled with technology the family normally treats as dangerous, unless Rick is nearby to control it. Summer ignores that rule after a breakup, while Beth becomes determined to fix the resulting disaster without asking her father for help. This is the story of how Morty moves from calling for Rick to understanding enough of one machine to take control of the problem himself. The Whirly-Durly conspiracy aired on August 20th, 2017, and its main adventure follows Rick and Jerry away from the Smith house. That absence matters because the home story begins with a problem Rick would normally solve almost immediately. Summer is hurt after Ethan leaves her for Trisha, and her reaction is to enter Rick's garage looking for a way to change the part of herself she believes caused the rejection. She uses the Morphizer XE, one of Rick's machines for altering a person's body, and the result goes far beyond anything she intended. Her body becomes enormous, turning a normal teenage insecurity into a physical crisis involving technology no one else in the house fully understands. Rick is gone, so Beth has to decide whether she is willing to contact the person who built the machine. Morty's first instinct is practical because he wants Rick called before another adjustment makes Summer worse. Beth refuses because she wants to prove the family can solve a problem without depending on her father. Her relationship with Rick has always included approval, resentment, competition, and the need to show that his absence did not leave her helpless. So Summer's crisis becomes tangled with that older family conflict almost immediately. Morty does not share Beth's need to prove anything, which lets him treat the machine as a problem instead of a test of pride. Morty has spent enough time around Rick's equipment to know that guessing can turn a bad situation into a much worse one. When Beth begins experimenting with the morphizer's settings, he warns her that the labels may not mean what she assumes. Rick's inventions often follow logic that feels obvious to Rick and dangerous to everybody else, making confidence a poor substitute for understanding. Beth keeps trying, and each attempt changes Summer again without restoring her properly. Morty watches one setting produce a result that can be compared with the next, which gives him something Beth is not using effectively. He can treat each failed adjustment as information instead of only as another failure that needs to be corrected immediately. That difference becomes clearer because Beth keeps approaching the controls with a destination already in mind. She wants the machine to obey an intuitive idea of what normal should look like, while the morphizer is operating through its own internal categories. Morty has fewer assumptions about what a setting ought to mean, which makes him more willing to let the machine reveal its logic through the results. His approach is still imperfect because he does not understand the engineering. Each mistake still narrows the range of possibilities. By the time several attempts have gone wrong, Morty has seen a sequence of cause and effect that did not exist when Summer first entered the machine. Morty's success also depends on remembering the sequence rather than one isolated setting. Each failed transformation shows him something about what the morphizer changes, and those results become more useful when compared together. Beth keeps trying to force the machine toward normal, while Morty watches the chain develop. By the time he acts, he is working from accumulated evidence rather than one confident guess. The family even tries the morphizer's customer support system, hoping the device can provide its own instructions. That route creates another problem instead of offering the safe help someone would expect from an ordinary product. Rick's technology exists in a world where automated assistants can be almost as dangerous as the machine itself, which gives Morty another reason to distrust easy fixes. Summer eventually leaves the house, adding a human problem to the technical one. Morty remembers where she planned to be because he paid attention to the situation with Ethan, which keeps his role grounded in more than gadgets. He understands why Summer used the machine and can connect the bizarre transformation back to the teenage pain underneath it. Morty's frustration with Beth also becomes more direct because he can see that her need to prove independence from Rick is interfering with the immediate goal of helping Summer. Beth is the adult in the room, yet Morty is the one separating the practical problem from the emotional contest. He is not trying to win an argument with Rick because Rick is not there. He wants Summer restored before another guess creates an even worse result. There is also a useful contrast in how Morty handles being uncertain. He begins by admitting Rick probably understands the problem better than anyone else in the house, so Morty has no personal status to protect when Beth fails. He can update his view without treating every correction as a defeat. Beth has attached the outcome to a larger question about whether she still needs her father, so every bad adjustment puts more pressure on her to prove the next one will work. Morty's lower pride gives him more room to learn. By the time he reaches the controls himself, his action is supported by several earlier observations. He has seen Summer's first transformation, watched Beth produce additional changes, followed the failed attempt to get help from the device's support system, and tracked Summer after she leaves. His confidence does not come from suddenly believing he is as smart as Rick. It comes from having enough accumulated evidence that continuing to wait would no longer be the most careful choice. Morty successfully uses the morphizer to restore Summer, and the result is one of the clearest early examples of him learning Rick's technology without Rick standing beside him. Vindicators 3 showed that Morty understood the habits of the man who created the danger. The morphizer story moves one step further because Morty has to understand enough of the object itself to produce the correct result. He still does not become a scientist in the same sense as Rick. The episode never shows Morty explaining the biology behind the device, rebuilding the machine, or describing how its internal systems work. His intelligence remains operational because he watches cause and effect closely enough to work out what the controls are doing and then applies that understanding successfully. That limitation makes the scene more believable and more useful for the larger argument. Morty does not need hidden superhuman intelligence for the moment to matter. He only needs to show that years around Rick have taught him how to learn in dangerous situations. He has become comfortable enough with impossible technology that he can observe patterns where another person sees a confusing control panel. Beth's role strengthens the point because she has acted with more confidence than Morty for most of the crisis. Her confidence does not protect Summer from bad decisions, while Morty's caution does not prevent him from reaching the correct solution once enough evidence has accumulated. The episode quietly separates appearing sure from actually understanding what the machine has shown. Summer being restored could have ended the home story with Morty in a purely protective role. He has fixed the immediate problem, learned from Beth's mistakes, and prevented Rick from needing to come home and rescue everyone. Morty then makes a second choice that changes the meaning of his new competence by taking the morphizer to Ethan because he is still angry about the way Ethan treated Summer. The same machine that nearly destroyed Summer's body and then became the tool used to save her is now something Morty understands well enough to use deliberately. He changes Ethan into a grotesque form and leaves him that way, with the post-credit material confirming that Ethan remains transformed after Morty's retaliation. The revenge creates a clean separation between intelligence and judgment. Morty has learned how to use the machine correctly in the technical sense, but the machine cannot decide whether his goal is reasonable. Summer benefits when Morty uses what he learned to restore her, while Ethan suffers when Morty uses the same understanding as punishment. That pattern matters across Rick and Morty because becoming more capable often gives a character more ways to make a bad decision. Rick's genius never guarantees good judgment, and Morty begins learning a smaller version of the same problem. Knowing how something works expands his options without telling him which option deserves to be chosen. The emotional reason for Morty's retaliation is easy to understand without inventing motives beyond the episode. He cares about Summer and has watched her hurt herself because of Ethan's rejection. Once Summer is safe, Morty still wants Ethan to experience a consequence. Rick's machine gives him a level of power an angry younger brother would never normally possess, and Morty uses it. The sequence therefore develops him in two directions at once. He becomes technically more competent while also becoming more dangerous when anger chooses the objective. The garage has taught him that impossible devices are things he can eventually understand, which is useful when someone needs help, and frightening when Morty decides another person deserves punishment. Beth also gets an uncomfortable version of the result she wanted. Rick never has to return and fix Summer, which proves that the family can survive the crisis without him. Yet Beth is not the person who gets them there. Morty succeeds because he spends less energy treating the machine as a test of identity and more energy treating it as a problem that reveals information through failure. Beth wants to prove she does not need Rick, while Morty begins by openly admitting they probably do. His willingness to admit that makes him more cautious, and that caution eventually gives him the time to learn enough that Rick becomes unnecessary after all. Morty reaches independence without making independence the goal. The morphizer also reflects how Morty's broader education has been happening across the series. Early Morty enters Rick's garage as someone who knows almost nothing about the objects around him. Every adventure adds portals, scanners, weapons, robots, medical devices, and machines with rules no normal teenager would encounter. Rick rarely gives him a formal lesson, but Morty keeps standing close enough to see what happens when those devices succeed or fail. Learning by exposure is slower than Rick's instant command of science, yet it still changes Morty. He becomes familiar with the idea that labels can mislead, settings can interact, and a machine may reveal its rules only after someone tests it. The morphizer story is one of the first times that accumulated familiarity becomes visible as a successful technical action. Rick never congratulates Morty because Rick is absent, and there is no scene where the smartest man in the universe announces that Morty has improved. Morty's evidence is the result. Summer returns to normal because he watched the machine carefully enough to understand the problem after other attempts failed. That lack of recognition fits Morty's development across the series because his intelligence often appears during emergencies rather than through a stable identity as the smart character. Everyone expects Rick to understand the impossible device, so Morty becomes noticeable when Rick is missing and somebody else has to solve the practical problem. The section also keeps a useful limit through the way Morty learns. He needs several examples before he feels confident enough to act, while Rick often begins with knowledge Morty could never reach from observation alone. Morty begins with uncertainty and reduces it by watching, which makes his ability different from Rick's without making it unimportant. The family context strengthens the result because Morty is the person in the house who spends the most regular time on adventures with Rick. Beth grew up around Rick but lost years with him after he abandoned the family, while Summer joins adventures at times. Morty is the partner who repeatedly stands beside Rick while dangerous technology is used under pressure. Summer's recovery is the concrete proof of what Morty learned, while Ethan's transformation is the warning attached to it. Morty can take a device he initially wants Rick to handle and become the person making deliberate decisions with it. The growth is real, and the restraint needed to use that growth responsibly is still incomplete. The Morphizer therefore becomes the best object to carry into the ending. At first, it represents the family touching something they do not understand. After Morty restores Summer, it represents how closely he has been watching Rick's world. When Morty carries it to Ethan, the same object becomes proof that increased competence can expand the damage a teenager is capable of causing. Morty has learned enough to do something Rick normally would have been expected to do, yet he remains an angry brother capable of using the same knowledge for revenge. That contradiction keeps the development believable because Morty does not need to become calmer or wiser every time he becomes smarter. He only needs the experiences to keep leaving skills behind, and the Morphizer is one of the first pieces of Rick's technology that shows those skills becoming useful without Rick in the room. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty can learn one of Rick's machines by watching what it does, but technology is only one place his ability hides. Fear and self-doubt slow him down in almost every ordinary social situation. When a detox machine removes the traits Morty hates in himself, the result shows how much ability can appear once hesitation disappears with them. Section 3. Morty becomes a teenage stockbroker without his insecurity. Rest and relaxation. Morty's intelligence is often hidden behind panic, hesitation, and the belief that somebody else understands the situation better than he does. A detox machine removes the traits Morty personally sees as toxic, leaving a version of him who moves through ordinary life with almost no insecurity. This is the story of how far that confidence carries Morty before the missing parts of him become impossible to ignore. Rest and Relaxation aired on August 27, 2017, during the third season of Rick and Morty. The episode begins after Rick and Morty return from a 6-day adventure in terrible condition. They are exhausted, filthy, emotionally overwhelmed, and clearly unable to keep moving through their normal routine as though nothing happened. Their adventures have taken enough out of them that even Rick accepts the idea of stopping for treatment. At an alien spa, they enter what they believe is a detoxification machine, but the machine does something far more personal than either expects. Instead of removing an objective list of unhealthy traits, it separates the qualities each person personally thinks are toxic. Morty's split is dramatic because the traits he rejects include many of the qualities that normally dominate his behavior. The anxious, self-hating, insecure side of Morty is pushed into the toxic world, while the version who walks out is calm, confident, socially smooth, and difficult to embarrass. His memories remain, which means Clean Morty does not suddenly download new information or gain Rick's scientific knowledge. What changes is the way he uses what he already knows. Fear stops interrupting his decisions, while shame and self-doubt stop telling him that every attempt is likely to end badly. School makes the change obvious because there is no alien monster or dangerous gadget around to explain it. Morty approaches Jessica with a level of confidence his ordinary self can barely maintain for a few seconds. He speaks clearly, reacts quickly, and stops treating every line of conversation like a possible disaster. The ability looks new even though the information inside Morty's mind has not been replaced. He is still reading the same people and using the same memories, but the delay between noticing an opportunity and acting on it has almost disappeared. That delay matters because ordinary Morty can lose a conversation inside his own head. He may notice that someone is interested, impatient, impressed, or uncertain, then spends so long wondering whether he read the signal correctly that the moment passes. Clean Morty responds before doubt creates a second argument inside him. He can also recover from small mistakes without letting one awkward moment define the rest of the exchange. Normal Morty often reacts to his own embarrassment, while Clean Morty keeps reacting to the person in front of him. That difference gives him a much stronger sense of timing. The episode never establishes that Morty's mathematics suddenly improves or that he gains some hidden scientific ability equal to Rick's. His transformation appears most strongly through communication, persuasion, and social control. Clean Morty reads the mood of a conversation, chooses language that helps him, and speaks with the kind of certainty that makes other people assume he belongs in the position he has taken. The intelligence is social and practical, which makes it different from the machines and bombs surrounding the earlier examples. That skill becomes more powerful because he also loses emotional restraints that normally make Morty hesitate before using people. The machine removes traits connected to guilt, attachment, and dependence, along with the anxiety Morty hates. Clean Morty can be charming because he understands what other people want, while caring much less about whether using that information is fair. The result complicates any idea that the detox machine revealed a perfect Morty. It revealed a version shaped by Morty's own dislikes, and a teenager who hates feeling afraid has no reason to understand how closely fear can sit beside caution, empathy, and emotional connection. Rick goes through the same basic process, which establishes that the machine is not creating objective health. Clean Rick remains arrogant and capable, while toxic Rick carries traits Rick personally rejects. The split is based on self-perception, and self-perception can be incomplete or deeply biased. Morty's new life keeps rewarding him enough that the cost is easy to ignore. His social interactions become smoother, ordinary situations stop feeling like traps, and the nervous boy who spent years wanting to be confident around Jessica suddenly experiences what life feels like without the voice that expects rejection. That reward matters when Morty faces pressure to reintegrate with his toxic side. Reuniting would mean taking back the insecurity, self-hatred, emotional need, and fear he has finally lived without. Clean Morty knows exactly what those traits feel like because they were part of him until the spa separated them, and he has no desire to surrender the relief he now feels. The conflict becomes more serious as the toxic versions resist being abandoned. Clean Morty treats toxic Morty as a threat to the identity he has built, so becoming whole again looks less like healing and more like losing a life that suddenly feels easier, more successful, and more independent. Clean Morty's behavior also keeps showing that confidence is not the only thing missing. He becomes colder toward people who once mattered to him and more willing to manipulate situations without feeling the same guilt. The normal Morty's awkwardness often comes from caring too much about how someone will react. Clean Morty keeps the ability to predict that reaction while losing much of the discomfort attached to exploiting it. The same change that frees his social ability also weakens the emotional limits that would normally tell him when that ability is being used badly. The story eventually reaches the point where Clean Morty chooses escape rather than reintegration. He does not want Rick to force him back into a personality he now sees as weaker, and his new confidence makes him much harder to control. The same traits that improve his social life also make him less emotionally dependent on Rick, which gives him the nerve to leave. His goals also become larger once confidence changes what he believes is possible. At school, the benefit is talking to Jessica without collapsing under his own nerves. Once Morty sees that the same calm works with adults, independence, money, and status stop looking like distant parts of adulthood and start looking like problems he can enter directly. The change also makes Morty more willing to treat unfamiliar adult spaces as learnable systems, because embarrassment no longer convinces him that entering those spaces is a mistake. Rick eventually tracks him to New York, and the episode reveals how far Morty's new personality has taken him. At 14 years old, Clean Morty has become a successful stockbroker. The setting is important because it removes almost every excuse for treating Morty's ability as a side effect of Rick's gadgets. Morty is not holding a portal gun, death crystal, alien scanner, or weapon. He is operating inside an adult financial workplace through language, confidence, nerve, and the ability to persuade people. His age makes the situation intentionally absurd, but the skill being exaggerated is clear. A normal 14-year-old entering that environment would face a credibility problem before any actual work began. Clean Morty behaves as though credibility can be built through presentation and results. He sounds certain enough that adults accept him as someone worth listening to, and he moves through a competitive world where hesitation would make him look weak. The episode does not need to claim that Morty has become a mathematical prodigy for the moment to matter. His success is presented through salesmanship, confidence, and the ability to speak as though he belongs in a room that should reject him on sight. Jacqueline, the adult woman in his New York life, keeps the fantasy from looking entirely healthy. She recognizes that Morty ran away and that the traits helping him succeed are connected to the missing conscience and emotional attachment created by the detox. His success cannot be separated from the personality split that made him willing to behave this way. Clean Morty is effective because he understands people and because fewer feelings stop him from using that understanding. The same quality that makes him impressive in business makes his personal relationships colder. Rick eventually arrives to bring him back, and Clean Morty resists because he understands what reintegration will cost. He has experienced a version of life where he can enter a room without feeling small. Returning to toxic Morty means accepting the fear and self-hatred that made his earlier life painful. His attempt to preserve that life is another sign of quick thinking because he is harder to manipulate through ordinary family pressure. Rick cannot simply rely on Morty's attachment to make him cooperate when emotional dependence has been weakened, so he has to force the issue. Rick eventually reintegrates Morty by injecting toxic Morty back into clean Morty, and the familiar anxious personality returns because the traits he tried to remove are part of the whole person. The episode refuses to present the confident stockbroker as the true Morty who should have been allowed to remain. Clean Morty is highly capable and also emotionally incomplete. That return creates the most useful interpretation of the section. Morty's anxiety can hide abilities without being the only thing standing between him and a perfect life. Clean Morty shows that Morty possesses social intelligence, adaptability, persuasion, and confidence that his usual fear makes harder to see, while the same experiment shows that removing fear can also remove restraints Morty needs. The result is more specific than saying Morty would be a genius if he stopped being nervous. His nervousness belongs to the same personality that cares deeply about other people, feels guilt, and recognizes danger. Clean Morty receives freedom from the painful parts while also losing some of the qualities that give his choices emotional weight. The stockbroker career therefore proves ability while exposing a cost. Morty can thrive in an ordinary adult environment when insecurity stops controlling him, and he can also become someone who treats people more like opportunities than relationships. That contradiction connects him to Rick without making them identical. Rick often looks powerful because shame and social pressure do not stop him from acting. Clean Morty briefly gains a smaller version of that freedom and immediately becomes more effective, independent, and willing to manipulate people. The qualities that make Rick difficult also show how useful a lack of hesitation can be when the goal is simply to get a result. Morty remains distinct from Rick. The detox still gives him a temporary taste of what it is like to move through the world without asking for permission from his own fear. The episode also changes how Morty's ordinary panic can be read in later stories. A frightened Morty is not automatically a Morty who has no idea what is happening. Sometimes he understands enough and cannot trust himself long enough to act. Clean Morty separates the knowledge from the fear, which lets the audience see what has been hidden underneath the nervous performance. That does not mean every normal hesitation is evidence of secret brilliance, because Morty can still be confused, inexperienced, and wrong. The narrower point is that some of his limitations come from confidence rather than ability. The New York setting strengthens that point because Morty has left Rick's world almost completely. Earlier examples could always be explained through exposure to Rick's technology. Here, Morty succeeds with ordinary tools. His business phone, his language, and the way he presents himself are enough to make adults take him seriously. The detox machine also gives Morty an accidental form of self-knowledge because the traits it removes reveal what Morty has been carrying as burdens. His fear and insecurity hurt him enough that he would remove them if the choice felt simple, and the episode shows why the choice is not simple once those traits are separated from everything they support. When Rick puts Morty back together, the series restores the boy who can panic, stumble through conversations, and doubt himself at the worst possible time. The reset does not erase what New York proved because the confident abilities came from Morty's own divided personality. The machine separated his traits rather than replacing him with another person. The stockbroker version therefore remains evidence of what Morty can do under very different emotional conditions. He can adapt to a new city, persuade adults, build status, and function independently from Rick, even though the regular Morty may struggle to show those same abilities through layers of fear. The business phone is the best object to close the section because the previous stories ended around a bomb and a body-altering machine, both created by Rick. Clean Morty holds an ordinary phone inside an adult workplace and makes himself successful without Rick's science. The object is normal enough that the unusual part of the scene has to be Morty. Later episodes bring the insecurity back, but they cannot undo the evidence that confidence and ability are separate things. Morty can be capable long before he feels capable, and his intelligence can appear through social reading, persuasion, and adaptation just as clearly as it appears around one of Rick's machines. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Clean Morty becomes effective after uncertainty is stripped away, but a death crystal offers another way to escape it by showing how each choice changes the future. Morty does not become fearless. He becomes obsessed with preserving one outcome and learns how quickly he can adjust his decisions to keep it visible. Section 4. Morty turns future sight into a strategy. Edge of Morty. Rick die. Rick Morty often hesitates because he cannot know which choice will improve his life and which one will create another disaster. A death crystal gives him constant glimpses of possible endings, and one of those endings appears to place Jessica beside him when he dies. This is the story of how Morty turns changing future information into a strategy while understanding less about his chosen destination than he thinks. Edge of Morty. Rick Die Rick Pete premiered on November 10, 2019, as the opening episode of Season 4. Rick brings Morty to Forbodulon Prime to collect death crystals, strange objects that show the person holding them possible ways they might die. The important rule is that the images can change when the holder changes what they are doing, which turns each vision into information about the direction of a current choice. Morty quickly sees one possible death that matters more to him than all the others. He appears to be an old man with Jessica beside him, and because Morty has spent years imagining her as part of the normal life he wishes he could have, the crystal seems to offer proof that one path toward that future exists. The image becomes powerful because Morty gives it a meaning before he understands the context. He assumes Jessica's presence at his deathbed reflects the lifelong romantic ending he wants. The crystal never explains that interpretation. It only shows the picture, while Morty supplies the story around it. Morty secretly keeps a crystal and begins watching how the image changes with every decision. During the trip away from the planet, his attention stays on the future, while Rick tries to manage the immediate danger, which gives Morty access to information Rick cannot see, even though Rick still understands the science behind the object better than he does. Rick dies during the resulting crash, and a holographic version of Rick appears to guide Morty through the resurrection process. Under normal conditions, restoring Rick would become the only problem Morty cares about. The death crystal creates a competing priority, because choices connected to Rick's return can move Morty away from the Jessica image. Morty keeps choosing the future he wants, which makes this example different from the earlier stories because the tool is not simply helping him survive. Morty has selected an objective and is now using the information to optimize around it. The crystal can reveal changing possibilities, but Morty decides which possibility deserves to control his behavior. Back on Earth, the system becomes more precise. Morty can watch the desired death appear or disappear in response to small choices, allowing him to adjust his words and actions almost immediately. One response moves him away from the image, another brings it back, and Morty keeps learning from those changes. He does not see every event that will happen between the present and his death. He only knows whether the current action appears compatible with the ending he wants, which means he can solve the future one decision at a time instead of calculating the whole path. That structure rewards someone who can react quickly and discard a choice the moment the signal changes. Morty does not need a long-range plan if every action generates another update. He can make a choice, see the target weaken or strengthen, and correct immediately. As he becomes more comfortable with the process, he also becomes willing to follow the signal when the individual action looks irrational. If an ordinary response makes the desired future disappear, Morty abandons it. If a strange response restores the image, he commits to it. The future becomes his test for success, even when the present no longer makes sense to anyone watching him. That is already a form of tactical intelligence, but it has a dangerous weakness. Morty is learning how to optimize before he has confirmed what he is optimizing for. The better he becomes at using the crystal, the easier it becomes to confuse the accuracy of the feedback with the accuracy of his interpretation. The object can honestly show that a choice changes his possible death without confirming why Jessica is present in that death. Morty receives reliable information and builds an unreliable story around it, which means every successful adjustment can actually make the original misunderstanding harder to question. School becomes the first place where that ability looks almost impossible. Morty handles confrontations and social situations with a level of precision his normal self rarely shows. He still worries about losing the desired future, but he stops worrying about each individual interaction because the crystal seems to tell him whether a choice is moving in the correct direction. Hologram Rick keeps trying to make Morty focus on restoring the real Rick, yet Morty repeatedly chooses the crystal's silent image over the explanation being offered by the person who normally guides him. The more often the future responds to his choices, the more confidence he develops in the system. The stakes rise when Morty begins using Rick's equipment while still following the crystal. Technology gives each decision much more power, A teenager adjusting his speech based on future feedback can manipulate a conversation, while a teenager with access to Rick's weapons can force police and other authorities to react on a much larger scale. Morty brings Mr. Meeseeks into the confrontation and keeps adapting as the situation changes. Every new threat creates more possible deaths, yet he continues finding actions that preserve the image he wants. The growing number of moving parts makes his adaptation harder to dismiss as simple luck because he is applying the same process across increasingly different problems. The courthouse sequence pushes that method into a completely different environment. Morty does not enter with a normal legal strategy. He follows the crystal and produces words that appear bizarre without context. The judge hears details that connect with deeply personal memories and reacts in a way that helps Morty. Morty then keeps using the crystal to influence how people around him respond. Sounds, statements, and movements that look meaningless can be tested by whether the desired future remains visible. He does not need to know every person's private history because the crystal functions like a signal telling him whether his latest input changed the outcome in the direction he wants. The courthouse also shows how quickly Morty can move between different systems without changing the basic method. A school hallway, a confrontation with police, and a courtroom operate through different rules, yet Morty treats all three as environments that can be probed through feedback. He tries an action, reads the updated future, and adjusts. The details change, while the mental process stays consistent. That flexibility matters because it prevents the crystal from doing every part of the work. The object does not explain courtroom procedure, identify which authority figure matters, or physically carry out Morty's choices. Morty still has to understand the immediate situation well enough to produce actions the environment can respond to. The method becomes especially powerful once Morty stops caring whether those actions appear reasonable to anyone else. Most people are constrained by the need to understand how their behavior will be interpreted. Morty can bypass some of that uncertainty because he sees the result indirectly through the death image. He can therefore use behavior that looks absurd in the present if the future keeps rewarding it. That willingness makes him difficult to predict because the people around him are trying to infer a normal goal from actions being selected according to information they cannot see. Morty's ability still has a clear boundary because he is not predicting the future himself. The crystal supplies the visions, and the visions are doing work no human brain could replace. Morty's intelligence appears in how quickly he learns to use changing information as practical guidance. The crystal does not hand him a full plan with every step written out. Morty has to keep trying actions, observing whether the future changes, and committing to choices that often make no sense under ordinary social rules. His ability is therefore adaptive rather than prophetic. Someone else holding the crystal might become overwhelmed by constantly changing possibilities. Morty narrows the information to one target and uses the target to reduce uncertainty. His obsession gives him focus, and that focus makes him efficient. The same focus is also reckless because every other source of judgment is being ignored. Morty is no longer asking whether a choice is fair, responsible, or sensible in the present. He asks whether the Jessica death remains available. A good feedback system can still drive terrible behavior when the goal attached to it is too narrow. Rick remains absent for much of the disaster, which prevents Morty from blaming the usual partner when the situation gets out of control. Rick is working through his own resurrection problem across alternate realities, including several worlds where fascist versions of familiar characters create new complications. Morty is making most of the choices on Earth without Rick directing him, and that independence matters because the episode is showing what Morty does when an impossible tool gives him information Rick does not control. The crisis eventually reaches the episode's Akira-inspired escalation. Morty combines the crystal's guidance with Rick's technology and becomes powerful enough to overwhelm normal attempts to stop him. The scale has moved far beyond saying the right thing around Jessica. Morty is now pushing through police, public reaction, and physical danger because one possible death still feels more important than everything happening around him. The transformation shows how dangerous his adaptive ability becomes when access to powerful technology removes ordinary limits. Morty can keep correcting his approach faster than the people around him can understand what his actual goal is. Rick eventually returns and helps bring the crisis under control. Morty cannot comfortably treat the disaster as something Rick caused because Rick was absent through much of the escalation. Morty had the crystal, the access to technology, and the chosen objective. The episode then gives Morty the information he should have wanted before he reorganized his life around the image. Jessica talks about being interested in working in hospice care, where she would comfort people at the end of their lives. Morty finally understands that the future he protected never proved that he and Jessica would grow old together as a couple. Her presence at his deathbed could be explained by her job rather than by the romance Morty imagined. The same image can lead to two completely different stories, and Morty spent the entire episode treating one interpretation as certainty. That reveal changes the meaning of his success. Morty really did become highly effective at preserving the image. He navigated school, police, court, public reaction, and escalating violence through constant feedback, and the method often worked exactly the way he intended. His understanding of the target was the part that failed. The distinction creates one of the cleanest limits on Morty's intelligence. He can become highly skilled at solving the problem he believes he has while misunderstanding the problem itself. That pattern later becomes important around Rick's inventions, where Morty often understands the experience a device offers before understanding the larger system that makes the experience possible. Jessica also brings the story back to ordinary human information, because a normal conversation about her plans would have explained the image more accurately than the impossible object Morty spent the episode obeying. The crystal therefore creates a strange form of certainty. Morty can see a possible ending with impossible clarity and still misunderstand what the ending means. Every successful adjustment gives him more confidence in the image without giving him more context, and success itself reinforces the assumption. Each time the Jessica death remains visible after another strange decision, Morty receives evidence that his method is working, making him less likely to question the interpretation because the system keeps rewarding his behavior. The comparison with Clean Morty shows two different ways Morty's ability can appear. Clean Morty succeeds because hesitation has been removed. Crystal Morty remains anxious, but the anxiety is narrowed toward one outcome. Instead of fearing every possible mistake, he fears losing one future strongly enough that other consequences become easier to ignore. That narrow fear gives him the confidence to act aggressively, just as Clean Morty's lack of social fear made manipulation easier. In both cases, Morty becomes more effective when uncertainty stops controlling every decision, yet the new effectiveness also creates a larger space for bad judgment. Morty's smartest behavior therefore sits beside one of his weakest assumptions. He learns the crystal quickly, combines its information with Rick's tools, and adjusts under pressure with impressive speed. Then Jessica casually reveals that the entire project was built around a story Morty invented from one image. The death crystal becomes the best object to leave behind because it looks like certainty in physical form. Morty can hold it, watch an ending change, alter his behavior, and see the ending respond again, yet the crystal still cannot explain what the image means. Morty leaves the story with evidence that fast adaptation and good information are not enough when the goal itself has been misunderstood. He can be brilliant at finding the route and still be wrong about the destination. That combination keeps his intelligence useful without turning every successful move into proof that he understands the larger picture. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The death crystal lets Morty adjust a choice before he reaches its final consequence. But his next big idea asks for something even more powerful: the ability to make the choice, see what happens, and return to the moment before it. Rick dislikes the idea enough that Morty eventually pushes him into building it anyway. Section 5. Morty gives Rick an idea he cannot ignore: the vat of acid. Episode. Rick usually controls which inventions deserve to exist, leaving Morty to complain from the passenger seat while someone else owns the science. A humiliating escape plan finally turns that imbalance into an argument over a concept Rick has refused to make for him. This is the story of what happens when Morty pushes hard enough to receive the save point device he thinks would make ordinary consequences optional. The Vat of Acid. Episode aired on May 17, 2020, during the 4th season of Rick and Morty. The story begins with Rick bringing Morty to a criminal exchange and preparing an escape before the deal has even started. His plan is a fake vat of acid that can make them appear to dissolve if the meeting goes wrong. Morty dislikes the idea because it feels embarrassingly simple beside everything Rick can build. His grandfather can cross dimensions, create impossible weapons, and alter the rules of ordinary life through science, so hiding under fake acid feels like something a stage magician might try rather than a plan designed by the smartest man Morty knows. The criminal meeting goes badly enough that Rick and Morty use the vat. The trick technically works, but the criminals remain nearby for far longer than expected. Rick and Morty have to stay submerged and maintain the performance while Morty's irritation grows. A plan Rick insists is clever becomes humiliating because success requires sitting still and waiting for other people to stop watching. Morty continues criticizing the idea after they return home, and the argument expands beyond the vat because he is tired of Rick treating every disagreement like proof that Rick's ideas are automatically better. Morty points toward a concept Rick has dismissed before and forces the conversation toward whether an idea originating with Morty can ever receive the same respect. He wants a device that works like a save point in a video game. A person could mark one moment, make a choice, experience what happens, and return to the saved point if the result goes badly. The appeal fits Morty's life because so many of Rick's adventures involve consequences arriving before Morty understands the decision he is making. Instead of asking for another weapon, Morty is asking for a new relationship with uncertainty itself. The request also reveals how Morty has learned to think around Rick. Morty does not begin with equations or a theory about how time should work. He begins with a human problem. People make choices without knowing the result, regret some of those choices, and wish they could test a path before committing to it. Morty takes that ordinary frustration and imagines a system that would change the rule completely. The video game comparison gives him a useful conceptual shortcut because save points are easy to understand even if the science needed to imitate one would be impossible for a normal person to describe. That difference separates Morty's idea from Rick's usual form of invention. Rick often begins with scientific possibility and creates something because he knows how. Morty begins with the experience he wants and asks whether Rick can make reality provide it. The concept remains dependent on Rick's science, but the direction of the request comes from Morty. He can explain the desired effect clearly enough that Rick knows exactly what would have to be achieved, even though Morty has no idea how to engineer the mechanism himself. Rick objects to the amount of work involved and to the way Morty talks about the concept as though the science should be easy. Morty keeps provoking him until the disagreement becomes personal. Rick eventually decides to build the device, partly because refusing after the argument would let Morty believe the idea defeated him. That decision gives Morty a different role from the earlier machine stories. He does not discover the device after somebody else misuses it. He helps create the reason it exists. The core experience comes from Morty, while Rick controls the science needed to make something like that experience possible. Rick eventually gives Morty the remote. The device appears simple from the user's side because Morty can save a moment, test an action, and return to the earlier point when he dislikes the outcome. The interface gives him the freedom he asked for without requiring him to understand how Rick solved the technical problem. Morty begins with small experiments and tries things he would normally avoid because embarrassment, pain, or social consequences could follow him afterward. Every reset teaches him that he can treat life like a series of branches, keeping the result he likes and discarding the rest. The device changes his caution quickly because ordinary consequences stop feeling permanent. Morty can test a social move, behave recklessly, or push a situation until he learns where it leads. The world becomes something he can explore by trial and error while believing only the final branch will count. That behavior connects naturally to the Death Crystal story. The crystal let Morty see information before a choice and adjust accordingly, while the save point remote appears to let him gather information after a choice and still escape the cost. In both stories, Morty is trying to remove uncertainty from a life where uncertainty normally controls him. The difference is that the remote gives Morty a stronger sense of ownership. The crystal kept showing him futures he could not fully interpret. The remote appears to let him create his own experiment, see the result, and personally decide whether the result deserves to remain. Morty learns the interface quickly enough that the device becomes ordinary to him, and that normalization matters because the power is enormous even though the controls are simple. A person who believes every mistake can be erased will naturally begin testing choices that once seemed too expensive. That experimental habit is intelligent in a narrow sense because Morty is constantly collecting information. He can see how people respond, what actions fail, and what choices produce the result he wants. The problem is that the information arrives inside a system Morty believes has no lasting cost, which removes the ethical pressure that normally limits experimentation on other people. The remote turns the same trial and error that helped him understand the morphizer into something more dangerous, because the things being tested now include relationships, embarrassment, and harm, rather than only machine settings. The episode gives the device a much larger test when Morty meets a girl and begins a relationship with her. The story spends time developing that relationship because Morty eventually does something he has rarely done with the remote. He stops resetting. Their relationship grows through ordinary time. They become close, share experiences, and build memories that matter because Morty allows them to stay. The device remains available, but Morty chooses not to erase difficult moments simply because he can. They eventually travel together and survive a plane crash in a frozen wilderness. The ordeal creates exactly the kind of suffering the remote was designed to escape. Morty could return to the earlier save point and remove the entire experience from his life, yet doing that would also erase the relationship and everything they built after that moment. Morty continues forward instead. He accepts fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty because the life connected to those experiences has become worth preserving. A device created to remove commitment sits unused while Morty commits to another person. The survival sequence gives the remote a new meaning. At the beginning, freedom meant being able to erase anything. During the relationship, freedom becomes the ability to reset and still choosing not to. Morty discovers that some consequences matter because they remain shared. That is an important development because the machine itself never teaches him restraint. He has to learn the limit through the experience the machine made optional. His smartest use of the remote becomes the decision to leave it alone when resetting would destroy something he values. The relationship survives the ordeal, and Morty returns home carrying a history he has chosen to keep. Jerry sees the remote and mistakes it for an ordinary household controller. Without understanding what it is, he presses the control and sends Morty back to the earlier save point before the relationship began. The loss hurts because Morty had finally chosen permanence. He remembers everything, while the girl no longer shares the same history because the world has returned to a version where their relationship never developed. Morty keeps the emotional cost without keeping the life that gave the cost meaning. That moment also reveals a limit on control that Morty did not consider when he imagined the device. Even if he uses it carefully, the object still exists in a house with other people who do not understand it. His plan depends on the assumption that he will always control the button, and Jerry's mistake destroys that assumption instantly. Morty still understands the remote, but personal skill cannot make a powerful object safe when somebody else can accidentally activate it. Morty eventually returns to using the remote, which prevents the relationship from turning into a permanent transformation. He remains impulsive, curious, and capable of choosing convenience again. Rick eventually reveals what Morty never understood about the machine. The remote did not create ordinary backward time travel. Rick built a more complicated system involving alternate realities and near-duplicate Mortys to create the experience of returning to a saved moment. From Morty's point of view, bad choices disappeared. From the larger system Rick constructed, the consequences had been displaced in ways Morty never saw. That reveal changes the meaning of the carefree experiments, because the interface made the action feel reversible while the hidden architecture carried a cost outside Morty's understanding. Morty thought he was testing choices without leaving anything behind. Rick's device was making the apparent erasure real through a multiverse process that affected other versions of Morty and the people around them. The exact mechanics are deliberately complicated, and Morty's intelligence does not depend on pretending he should have guessed them. Rick designed the device, withheld the explanation, and gave Morty an interface that encouraged the obvious interpretation. The useful limitation is simpler. Morty understood the experience he wanted without understanding what reality would have to do in order to provide it. Morty's original idea still shows a kind of intelligence separate from Rick's engineering. The idea itself is strong enough that Rick takes it seriously enough to build an elaborate answer. Morty identifies a powerful use for technology and forces Rick to engage with a concept that did not begin with Rick. He also understands the finished interface quickly, explores what it makes possible, and eventually discovers through experience that unlimited resetting can make commitment meaningless. Rick then makes the hidden cost impossible to ignore. He can merge the consequences in a way that brings the people affected by Morty's supposedly erased actions into one reality. The choices Morty treated as temporary now return together, and people he hurt, embarrassed, manipulated, or used during his experiments suddenly have reasons to confront him. The world answers back all at once because Rick has removed the protection Morty thought the device guaranteed. Morty needs an escape, and Rick offers the same fake vat of acid Morty mocked at the beginning. The plan becomes satisfying because the story has spent so much time increasing the complexity around Morty's idea. The remote appears to defeat consequences through multiverse science, while Rick's simple theatrical trick depends on patience, timing, and other people believing what they see. Morty accepts the vat because the more advanced answer has created a situation he cannot control. Rick wins their petty argument, although the amount of work required to win also reveals how strongly Morty's challenge affected him. Rick did not build the device to save the universe. He built it because Morty insulted his idea and pushed on his pride. That means Morty's concept receives a strange form of respect through the effort Rick spends trying to prove him wrong. The relationship sequence keeps the section from becoming a simple battle between egos because Morty starts by wanting consequence-free experimentation and eventually finds something important enough that he stops experimenting. Jerry's accidental reset destroys that progress, while Rick's reveal proves the device never worked according to the simple rule Morty believed in the first place. The fake vat becomes the best final image because it represents everything Morty thought a genius should not need. It is simple, embarrassing, and almost childish beside Rick's machines, yet it works because the situation requires a believable performance rather than a more advanced piece of science. Morty's remote is the opposite kind of object. It looks like the perfect answer to uncertainty and hides a system too large for him to see. Morty understands the surface experience and uses it creatively, while Rick controls the architecture underneath. The section therefore gives Morty credit for conceptual intelligence while preserving Rick's advantage in high-level science. Morty can identify an interesting problem, imagine a powerful solution, and understand why that solution would transform ordinary life. Rick remains the person capable of turning the concept into a working device with rules Morty does not know enough to anticipate. Morty leaves the story having learned that a clever idea and full understanding are different achievements, and the vat closes the circle because the argument began with Morty insulting something simple and ends with him depending on the same simple solution after the complicated device collapses around him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty wanted a device whose hidden rules he never fully understood, but a later mistake with portal fluid puts one of those hidden rules directly into his body and connects him to a stranger. Rick is no longer beside him to explain the solution, leaving Morty to find out how much he has actually learned about surviving Rick's technology alone. Section 6. Morty solves a portal trap without Rick. Forgetting Sarek Morchel. Morty has spent enough time beside Rick to start using portal travel as though it belongs to both of them, even though Rick still controls the technology behind it. One attempt to hide that independence leaves a portal embedded in Morty's hand and connects him to a stranger with another portal on his body. This is the story of how Morty creates a problem Rick never comes to solve for him. Forgetting Sarek Morchel aired on September 5, 2021, as the 9th episode of Season 5. It opens with Morty secretly using Rick's portal gun to revisit places damaged during earlier adventures. Instead of chasing another thrill, Morty is trying to repair some of the destruction he and Rick left behind. That opening already shows how much portal travel has changed for him. Early in the series, stepping through one of Rick's portals could send Morty into panic because he had no idea where he was going. By Season 5, he can take the gun, select destinations, revisit previous worlds, and move through the process without Rick supervising every step. The independence still has limits because Morty does not own the technology in the way Rick does. He can use the portal gun. Safely manufacturing the fluid or controlling every rule behind the system remains beyond him. When he realizes that the supply is low, he tries to hide what he has done instead of admitting he borrowed the gun. That decision reveals the difference between familiarity and mastery. Portal travel feels routine to Morty because he has seen it so often. Yet the chemistry inside the gun remains far beyond the part of the system he actually understands. His attempt to hide the shortage makes the problem worse because Morty treats the portal fluid like something he can replace through ordinary improvisation. Years beside Rick have taught him confidence around impossible objects, and that confidence carries him into a part of the technology Rick never taught him. Morty tampers with the fluid, spills it onto his hand, and ends up with a portal embedded directly in his body. Somewhere else, a matching portal appears on the thigh of a man named Nick. The two strangers are now physically linked through technology neither one can simply switch off. Rick discovers that Morty has been using his equipment, and their argument expands beyond the spilled fluid. Morty is tired of being treated like a replaceable sidekick who has no ownership over adventures that consume his life. Rick is angry that Morty took the portal gun and tried to conceal the evidence. The fight becomes a breakup, and Rick responds by choosing two crows as new partners. What begins as a joke quickly lands on something Morty already fears because Rick can travel anywhere and meet almost anyone. If he decides Morty is no longer worth the trouble, he has the power to find a replacement. Morty is left with the portal in his hand while Rick begins proving that another partnership is possible. That emotional pressure makes Nick's arrival more attractive because Nick presents himself as someone who also understands what it is like to be damaged by Rick. Nick's portal is physically connected to Morty's, which gives them a shared problem before trust has been earned. He tells a story that makes him sound like another person hurt by Rick's careless behavior, and Morty is angry enough at his grandfather that the explanation fits easily into what he already believes. The two begin imagining a partnership that could exist outside Rick's control. They call themselves the Portal Boys, and treat the accident as the beginning of something equal. Morty has spent years as the junior partner beside a genius who owns the portal gun, decides where they go, and can end the adventure whenever he wants. Nick appears to offer companionship without that hierarchy. The idea gives Morty emotional relief even before it becomes practical because somebody else finally seems to understand his complaints about Rick without dismissing them. At the same time, Rick's relationship with the two crows becomes more meaningful than Morty expected. Rick begins taking the partnership seriously enough that the joke becomes uncomfortable, forcing Morty to confront the possibility that his role was less unique than he believed. That fear helps explain why he accepts Nick too quickly. The new friendship seems to answer the humiliation of being replaced. Morty can prove he does not need Rick by building a partnership of his own, which makes him less cautious about whether Nick has actually earned his trust. The structure mirrors one of Morty's recurring weaknesses. He can see the flaws in the person closest to him clearly and still become vulnerable to someone who presents the opposite image. Nick knows how to position himself as the person who understands Morty, respects him, and shares his anger. Those qualities feel convincing, partly because they answer needs Rick has just refused to meet. Morty's criticism of Rick can be accurate, while his assumption that Nick must therefore be safe remains wrong. The physical portal problem remains unresolved, so Morty and Nick start looking for supplies and information that might help. Their efforts bring them into situations where Nick's behavior becomes harder to excuse. He is willing to hurt people much more casually than Morty expected, and he begins killing during their attempt to obtain what they need. Morty has seen Rick use violence across countless adventures, but Nick was supposed to represent an alternative to that damage. The safer partnership Morty imagined starts looking like another relationship where the person beside him can turn a practical problem into a deadly one. The portals make leaving difficult because Morty cannot simply walk away. Their bodies remain connected, and anything involving one opening affects the other. The social mistake has become a physical trap. Morty begins paying closer attention to Nick's story, and the small contradictions he ignored earlier become more important as Nick grows more dangerous. Eventually, Morty realizes that the history Nick used to build their connection does not hold together. That realization matters because Morty has to give up an explanation he wanted to believe. Nick's story made Rick the common enemy, and made Morty's decision to leave feel justified. Recognizing the lie means admitting that anger helped him trust the wrong person. Morty updates anyway. He stops treating emotional agreement as proof that Nick is safe and starts responding to the evidence in front of him. That correction becomes one half of the solution because Morty has to escape the social trap before he can solve the physical one. The harder problem is the portal connection itself. Nick is openly dangerous, and Morty is still linked to him through the two openings. Rick is not standing nearby with a scanner or an explanation. There is no death crystal showing the safest move and no save point remote that can remove a failed attempt. Morty has to reason from the rule he can actually observe. Anything passing through one portal emerges through the other. His hand carries one opening while Nick's thigh carries the second. The connection that gives Nick access to Morty also gives Morty a path back toward Nick. Morty has already spent much of the episode experiencing the portal from both directions, which means he has practical evidence to work with. He knows the connection is immediate, knows the openings remain tied to specific parts of their bodies, and knows ordinary distance does not remove the link. Those observations do not explain the deeper science. Together, they define the local system he needs to manipulate. Morty does not have to solve portal physics in general. He only needs to understand enough about these two connected openings to create an advantage before Nick can hurt him again. Morty recognizes that the portal on his hand has become a component in the trap. Once he starts thinking about the hand as something that can be repositioned rather than only as part of his body, a much harsher solution becomes possible. Near a railway, Morty commits to that solution by positioning the hand carrying the portal where a passing train can sever it from his body. The injury is deliberate because remaining attached to the portal means remaining attached to Nick. Morty then takes the severed hand and places its portal into the portal on Nick's thigh. The two linked openings interact destructively and Nick is destroyed, ending the threat. The solution is brutal, but every important part of it comes from rules Morty has already observed, rather than from new information supplied at the last second. The sequence is one of Morty's clearest moments of improvisation because the episode gives him almost nothing external to rely on. He does not receive a hidden tool, and Rick does not return with a perfect explanation. Morty takes the physical rule established by the problem and changes the arrangement until that rule works in his favor. The episode never gives a real scientific explanation for what happens when one linked portal is placed through the other, and Morty's intelligence does not require one. He understands the local behavior well enough to identify a possible exploit under pressure. That difference matters after the Vat of Acid episode. Morty failed to understand the hidden architecture of the save point device because Rick controlled rules far beyond the interface. Here, Morty still lacks the deeper science, but the rule causing the immediate problem is visible enough for practical reasoning. He knows what the portals do in the situation he is actually facing, and that limited knowledge is enough to build a solution even though he could not reproduce the technology from scratch. The solution also carries a real cost in the moment. Morty cannot reset after losing his hand, and he has no vision telling him the choice leads to a perfect future. He acts because the alternative is worse. The intelligence appears through a willingness to accept damage as part of the solution rather than waiting for a painless option that does not exist. Years with Rick have changed Morty's threshold for action enough that he can look at his own hand, a moving train, and the structure of the portal connection, then commit before the person threatening him can stop him. Morty remains scared and angry while doing it. He does not need the emotional removal Clean Morty received in order to act. The regular Morty, with all of his fear and insecurity intact, still solves the problem under pressure. Rick later repairs the missing hand, which creates a useful contrast between their abilities. Rick possesses the technology to restore Morty's body after the crisis, while Morty survived long enough to need that repair because he solved the dangerous part himself. Their relationship does not repair as quickly. Rick's time with the two crows has forced him to think about how unhealthy the old partnership had become, and he leaves with them rather than immediately returning to the familiar setup. Morty's successful independence, therefore, does not earn the exact emotional reunion he wants. The opening cleanup montage becomes more important after that ending because Morty was already trying to take responsibility for the damage left by earlier adventures. His secret portal use was dishonest, but the purpose was not purely selfish. He had started acting like someone who understood that visiting another world creates consequences after Rick decides the adventure is finished. That responsibility is another form of learning. Morty knows how to return to previous locations, remembers what happened there, and cares enough to repair some of the damage. The same independence creates the portal accident because he still does not understand the technology fully. Nick also becomes a warning about Morty's ability to read people. Morty correctly recognizes many of Rick's flaws, but anger makes him vulnerable to anyone who confirms those flaws. His later correction is therefore as important as the portal trick because he catches a contradiction, changes his judgment, and stops letting the original emotional story control his decision. Both solutions require Morty to stop accepting the situation in the form somebody else handed it to him. Nick's story says Rick is the common enemy, while the portal connection says Morty and Nick are trapped together. Morty challenges both assumptions and finds a different path. The severed hand becomes the best object to leave behind because it carries the whole progression. Morty created the portal through a careless attempt to hide what he did, and for most of the episode, the hand is evidence that he touched technology he could use but could not safely control. At the climax, the same hand becomes part of a solution Rick never gives him. Rick can restore the hand afterward, but he cannot give Morty the experience of solving the trap because Morty already earned that before Rick arrived. The episode leaves Morty still dependent on Rick for impossible science and much less dependent on Rick for every decision that keeps him alive. He once survived by recognizing drunk Rick's habits, then learned how to operate one of Rick's machines, and later imagined a device Rick could build. By the time Nick turns on him, Morty can observe a dangerous system, catch a lie, accept a painful cost, and improvise a way out while Rick is somewhere else. The intelligence remains practical, which keeps it different from Rick's. Morty does not become a portal scientist. He becomes someone with enough experience inside Rick's world to reason from the rules he can see, and when survival depends on using those rules before anyone explains them, that difference is enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty proves he can survive a crisis without Rick solving it for him, yet his identity is still tied to being one Morty beside one Rick. A game malfunction soon tears that identity into billions of pieces, and one small part of Morty gets enough time and independence to become someone Rick can no longer treat like a simple fragment. Section 7. A fragment of Morty builds an entire movement. Rick, a mort well lived. Morty usually struggles to make Rick treat one complete Morty like an equal. A malfunction inside Roy, a life well lived, scatters Morty's identity across billions of people, leaving Rick to gather those pieces back into one mind. This is the story of how a single fragment named Marta grows influential enough that Rick has to negotiate with part of Morty instead of simply collecting him. Rick a Mort Well Lived aired on September 11, 2022, as the second episode of Season 6. Rick, Morty, and Summer visit Blips and Chits, where Morty enters the life simulator Roy a Life Well Lived. A terrorist attack interrupts power to the arcade while Morty is still inside the game. When the machine restarts, Morty does not return as one person. His identity has been distributed across the game's enormous non-player population, so every non-player character inside the simulation now carries some piece of Morty. Rick cannot solve the problem by locating one body and pulling him out, because Morty now exists as a civilization. Rick enters the game as Roy and begins trying to gather Morty's fragments. The rescue is complicated by the difference between outside time and time inside the simulation. Only a short period passes in the arcade, while decades can pass for people living inside the game. That time difference changes the moral shape of the problem almost immediately. Rick knows every person is part of Morty from the outside perspective, while the people inside have homes, families, jobs, beliefs, and years of personal history. They experience themselves as complete lives, rather than as pieces waiting to be reassembled. Rick begins spreading the explanation that all of them are parts of one teenage boy named Morty and that leaving the map will reunite them with their true identity. The claim sounds absurd from inside the simulation, but Rick has the external knowledge needed to prove enough of it that a movement begins forming. The rescue gradually becomes a social and political project. Rick's problem is no longer whether an exit exists because he knows how the system works. His problem is convincing billions of people to give up the lives they currently experience in order to become part of someone they have never met as a whole person. Marta becomes one of the most important figures in that process. She begins as one Morty fragment among many, yet she develops into an effective organizer and communicator. Rick has the explanation, while Marta becomes capable of making the explanation meaningful to people who have spent their entire lives inside the game. Her influence grows across simulated decades as families age, relationships change, and the people carrying pieces of Morty accumulate memories that the original Morty outside the game will never consciously experience in the same way. Marta builds credibility because people watch her make decisions and live beside them. That long timeline gives Marta something the main Morty rarely receives during an ordinary adventure: years to deal with the consequences of persuasion. Morty often has to convince someone quickly and then move on before the social effects develop. Marta lives among the people she influences. If she makes a promise, the community remembers it. If she changes direction, followers have time to question why. Leadership becomes a sustained skill rather than a single successful speech, and that difference lets a fragment of Morty develop patience and social authority the main character rarely gets enough uninterrupted time to practice. Marta also has to translate Rick's outside knowledge into language that makes sense inside the simulation. Rick can insist that their entire civilization exists inside an arcade cabinet, but the claim is useless unless people can connect it to decisions in their own lives. Marta becomes important because she can bridge those perspectives. She understands the rescue goal and also understands why someone with a family and decades of memory would resist it. Rick can supply proof and technological knowledge, while Marta supplies trust, which makes him dependent on a form of intelligence he often undervalues. Rick eventually reaches the point where roughly 92% of Morty's fragments are prepared to leave. The number matters because it shows the scale of what Marta helped build. Rick started with a strange claim about an arcade outside their universe, while Marta helped turn that claim into something almost the whole simulated population was willing to act on. The remaining resistance creates the section's central conflict because those people are also pieces of Morty. Rick cannot dismiss their refusal without facing the fact that parts of Morty do not want what he wants. Some fragments have built lives they value enough that returning to one teenage body feels like losing themselves. Marta's own history makes that choice much harder than a normal argument between Rick and Morty. She has a father, relationships, responsibilities, and decades of memory. Returning to Morty does not feel like stepping out of a temporary role from her perspective. It feels like ending a life. Rick's factual advantage, therefore, cannot settle the conflict. He can know the arcade exists and still fail to answer what an individual life inside the game owes to the original Morty. Marta understands both sides because she is part of Morty and also a person who has lived long enough to care about what happens to her own world. Her leadership becomes more than giving speeches because people trust her after living beside her. She understands the language and fears of the society Rick is trying to move, and by the time Rick depends on her, Marta's opinion carries enough weight that large groups respond to what she chooses. The main Morty often struggles to make Rick take one objection seriously. Marta reaches a point where Rick has to consider how an entire political movement may react to her decision. The president inside the simulation becomes the strongest organized opponent to Rick's plan. He understands enough about the truth to recognize that Rick's relationship with Morty creates a weakness in the rescue. Rick needs every fragment to trust him, yet years beside the real Morty have shown how uncomfortable Rick becomes when trust requires emotional honesty. The president pushes directly on that history by arguing that Rick mistreats Morty and questioning why any part of Morty should willingly return to a life where Rick holds so much control. The criticism lands because Marta is still Morty enough for that history to matter, while her separate lifetime gives her enough distance to examine it differently. Rick can solve impossible technical problems, but this one cannot be forced through a better machine. The exit already exists. The obstacle is consent, loyalty, and whether the people inside believe Rick deserves the authority he is asking them to give him. Marta becomes the person standing between Rick and a clean solution because her influence is now independent from his. She started as someone helping Rick explain the truth, but over time people begin following her judgment even when it conflicts with Rick's. The president understands that dynamic and uses it. He encourages Marta to see reintegration as surrender and points toward Rick's inability to express the affection or respect that might make the choice feel safe. Marta's hesitation then affects people who trust her personally. The conflict grows into war because a disagreement over Morty's identity now divides a civilization. The rescue operation that looked simple from outside has accumulated enough history for people to fight over whether it should happen, and Marta's position has become important enough that governments react to what she chooses. That scale creates pressure on Marta herself because every personal doubt now has public consequences. If she resists Rick, followers may resist because they believe in her. If she agrees with Rick, people may interpret the choice as proof that their own lives should be abandoned. Leadership gives Marta influence while making private uncertainty much more expensive. The long time scale is essential to understanding her intelligence because she does not become a political leader in a few hours of normal Morty time. She lives long enough to develop skills the original Morty rarely has time to build, including persuasion, alliance building, and the ability to see how authority changes other people's choices. Her success becomes visible in the size of the following around her. Rick may have introduced the central idea, but Marta becomes the person capable of making that idea move through society. She translates a bizarre external truth into something people can organize their lives around. The high point arrives when her influence becomes large enough that Rick cannot complete the rescue on his own terms without dealing with her. A fragment of Morty's mind has developed enough authority to make the smartest man in the room negotiate. That position reveals a form of Morty's intelligence the earlier sections did not need. Marta's strength is leadership. She understands people well enough to build trust, shape a movement, and make her personal decision matter to a huge population. The power also creates a problem Marta eventually recognizes. Some people remain because they are loyal to her rather than because they have independently decided staying is best. Her influence has become strong enough that other people's choices are being shaped by their attachment to her, which means the movement can stop representing the people it claims to protect. Marta releases those followers from their loyalty and allows them to decide without treating support for her as a requirement. The choice matters because she gives up part of her own power at the exact moment she could use it to preserve her position. That decision makes the leadership look more intelligent rather than less. Marta recognizes that influence can become another form of pressure, and she chooses not to turn personal loyalty into a reason for other fragments to sacrifice the life they want. Before Rick completes the evacuation, Marta gives him one condition. The episode does not let the audience hear the exact wording, which means the story has to preserve that uncertainty rather than inventing a line. Morty eventually returns outside the game, after Rick gathers almost all of the fragments. From the arcade, the rescue looks complete enough for Rick and Morty to move forward, and the enormous civilization inside the cabinet becomes invisible to everyone who only sees the machine. Then the arcade employees reveal that somebody paid to keep the Roy cabinet operating on its own. Inside the game, the story centers on an old woman living out the rest of her life, strongly identifying that surviving figure as Marta. The ending strongly suggests that Marta's condition involved remaining in the game rather than being reintegrated, although the episode never states the agreement directly. That uncertainty improves the ending because the audience can see the result without needing Rick to explain every part of the decision. The still-running cabinet changes the meaning of the rescue. Rick began by treating every person as a percentage of Morty that needed to be collected. Marta's life forces a harder question, because one percentage has decades of memory, relationships, values, and enough influence to lead a world. Marta's ability stands apart from Rick's inventions, because almost none of her success depends on science. The simulation creates the environment, but her success is social. She organizes, persuades, negotiates, survives political conflict, and becomes influential enough that Rick cannot ignore her choices. She is also only a fragment of the main Morty, which makes the result more interesting because whatever qualities helped Marta succeed exists somewhere inside the person Rick normally treats as his sidekick. The weekly structure of Morty's life rarely gives those qualities decades to grow. The comparison with rest and Ricklaxation helps make the point clearer. Clean Morty revealed what happened when several painful traits were removed. Marta reveals what can happen when one part of Morty gets enough time to develop inside an environment where Rick cannot define every part of her life. Rick still deserves credit for understanding the external system and starting the rescue. Marta does not invent the truth about the simulation or build the exit. Her intelligence appears after Rick supplies the larger goal. She becomes the person capable of moving billions of lives toward or away from that goal, without becoming smarter than Rick in science. A fragment of Morty can simply be better positioned to solve a social problem Rick's technical knowledge cannot solve by itself. The old woman inside Roy is the best ending image, because the cabinet looks ordinary from the arcade. Behind that screen, one part of Morty has lived long enough to become a leader, make a choice Rick has to respect, and continue a life outside the main Morty's awareness. Morty leaves the arcade mostly restored to the familiar teenager, which allows the series to continue without turning Marta into a permanent personality upgrade. The machine stays behind, carrying evidence of something the weekly format usually hides. A portion of Morty can develop judgment, influence, and independence when given enough time away from the usual Rick and Morty pattern. Rick gets his grandson back, while one part of that grandson appears to remain somewhere Rick cannot simply order home. Marta never builds a portal gun or solves an impossible equation. She becomes important enough to change the behavior of a world, then aware enough to recognize when people should be freed from loyalty to her. The still-powered Roy cabinet, therefore, becomes proof that Morty's ability can grow in directions Rick's science does not control. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marta gains independence by spending decades in a world where Rick cannot define every part of her life. Morty soon faces the opposite problem, inside a reality where Rick appears to be beside him. To escape, Morty has to decide whether the person guiding him actually behaves enough like the real Rick to be trusted. Section 8. Morty solves the fear hole without Rick. Fear no Mort. Morty normally enters impossible situations, expecting Rick to identify whatever rule they are missing, even when Morty is the person panicking first. The fear hole keeps giving him apparent answers, then proving that each answer was incomplete while the Rick beside him seems to understand more than he does. This is the story of how Morty finally escapes by recognizing something wrong with the person he trusts to guide him. Fear No Mort aired on December 17, 2023, as the Season 7 finale. Rick and Morty are at a Denny's when they learn about the fear hole, an attraction hidden in the restroom that promises to confront anyone who enters with the fear controlling them. Morty jumps into the hole before Rick does, and that choice becomes crucial because everything that follows is filtered through Morty's experience. He enters expecting fear to behave like another dangerous Rick and Morty problem, something with a hidden rule that can eventually be discovered and beaten. Rick soon appears to join him, restoring the familiar partnership. Morty now has the person he normally relies on during impossible situations standing beside him again. Together, they begin trying to work out what the Hole wants and which fear has to be faced before the experience will end. The Hole refuses to behave like a normal puzzle. Morty and Rick encounter frightening scenarios, appear to make progress, and reach moments that feel like escapes, only for another detail to reveal that the experience is still continuing. That structure attacks one of Morty's most useful learned habits. Earlier stories rewarded him for watching cause and effect. A drunk Rick rant led to a clue, a machine setting produced a physical change, a death crystal changed its images, and a portal moved objects between two openings. The fear hole can create feedback too, but the feedback itself may be part of the trap. Escaping one frightening situation does not prove Morty escaped the hole, identifying one fear does not prove it is the deepest fear, and even a peaceful return to ordinary life can be another layer. Morty therefore has to become suspicious of success itself. That is difficult, because the hole can imitate the relief that follows a solved problem, giving him a feeling of completion while keeping him inside the system. Every time Morty accepts an answer too quickly, the hole has another chance to show why certainty is dangerous. He gradually stops treating relief as proof. A normal-looking restaurant, a solved emotional conflict, or a return to familiar life can no longer end the investigation by itself because the experience has taught him that comfort can be manufactured. That change matters because Morty is usually eager for an adventure to become simple again. Once he believes Rick has solved something, he often accepts the answer because Rick has a long history of knowing more than he does. The fear hole punishes that habit repeatedly until Morty begins demanding stronger evidence from the reality around him. He starts testing the explanation rather than only the environment. A monster can disappear and still leave him inside the hole, while a fear can appear conquered and still be part of a deeper fear. Morty needs the story explaining the experience to remain consistent over time. The presence of Rick initially seems like the most stable part of that story. Morty knows Rick better than he knows the hole, and Rick usually understands impossible technology faster than he does. If the world around them becomes unreliable, Rick appears to be the reference point Morty can still use. The hole gradually turns that assumption into part of the test. Diane becomes involved in the simulated experience, giving Rick access to a person whose loss shaped much of his life. Morty understands enough about Rick's history to know that Diane carries emotional weight no normal adventure can match. Her presence changes Morty's place inside the experience because Rick suddenly appears to have access to a life that existed before Morty. The possibility of Rick getting something back makes Morty's own importance easier to question. The hole also stretches the experience across time and changing realities. Morty faces scenarios that seem to continue beyond a single scare in a bathroom, and he has to live inside outcomes long enough that they start feeling normal before another reveal removes that certainty. The death crystal once gave Morty too much confidence in a visible outcome, while the hole gives him reasons to distrust every outcome, including the ones that feel emotionally satisfying. Morty and the Rick beside him keep producing explanations for what the hole is testing. Each answer gives them a temporary framework, and each framework eventually breaks when another layer appears. Morty learns that naming a fear is not the same as proving the fear was the point. The wall outside the hole gives him one useful piece of grounding because other people have completed the challenge and left photographs, which suggests the experience does have an ending. Morty knows escape is possible even when he cannot trust the latest reality, and that keeps him searching instead of surrendering to the idea that the hole is endless. Diane's presence adds pressure without becoming a simple answer. The hole can use Rick's history to reach Morty's insecurity because Morty understands that Diane represents a relationship Rick lost long before their current partnership existed. If Rick could have that life back, Morty has to face what his own role might become. The fear does not need to appear as a monster because the possibility of becoming less important can be enough. Morty also has fewer external facts to rely on. He cannot measure Rick's grief with a scanner or compare Diane's presence with a technical manual. He has to use years of memory about how Rick behaves when he is hurt, defensive, affectionate, or afraid to admit attachment. That is a form of evidence Morty has been collecting since the beginning of the series. Rick may hide emotion behind sarcasm, anger, drinking, or intellectual superiority, but Morty has seen enough versions of those reactions to know their general shape. The fear hole can imitate Rick's appearance and voice, yet the imitation still has to remain believable against all of that accumulated experience. This gives Morty a reference the hole cannot completely invent for him because the fake Rick has to match a person Morty already knows in uncomfortable detail. The simulated Rick becomes increasingly emotionally available as the layers continue. He eventually gives Morty the kind of reassurance Morty has wanted across the series, treating Morty's place beside him as secure and speaking as though Morty does not need to worry about being replaced. For someone who has watched Rick replace partners, abandon people, and treat attachment like weakness, that reassurance should feel like the answer Morty has always wanted. The Hole has spent the entire experience teaching Morty to distrust easy completion, and that training finally becomes useful when the emotional answer starts feeling too perfect. Morty pays attention to the response instead of accepting it because it feels good. The version of Rick beside him does not fit the man Morty knows because the reassurance is too complete and too carefully shaped around Morty's fear. The statement matches what Morty wants more closely than it matches the person he has spent years observing. That contradiction becomes the clue the Hole cannot safely hide. Making fake Rick perfectly comforting also makes him less believable, and Morty recognizes that the emotional answer is behaving like part of the fear rather than like the real Rick. Morty realizes that Rick never entered the Hole and that the person who appeared to guide him through the experience has been part of Morty's own fear simulation. The real Rick remained outside while Morty faced every layer alone. That reveal changes the meaning of the entire adventure. Morty spent the experience assuming Rick was supplying the intelligence needed to interpret the Hole. Once fake Rick is exposed, Morty has to recognize that the useful reasoning has been happening inside an experience generated around Morty's own mind. The simulated Rick can use Morty's knowledge of Rick, but the person who notices the imitation has failed is Morty. He solves the final layer by knowing Rick well enough to reject a version designed to satisfy him. The skill is a mature version of what Vindicators 3 established. Morty once recognized drunk Rick through repeated rants, sloppy bombs, and ugly opinions. Here he recognizes a false Rick through emotional behavior. The subject has become harder because Morty wants the fake version to be real. Rejecting an unpleasant clue is easy when the clue points toward danger. Rejecting the exact reassurance he has wanted for years requires more honesty. The Hole then pushes Morty toward the fear underneath the layers. His dependence on Rick is connected to the fear that his place is insecure, and that Rick could decide he no longer needs him. That fear has appeared in different forms across the series. Morty hoped Rick's hidden affection in Vindicators 3 would point toward him and discovered Rick was talking about Noob Noob. Rick later replaced him with 2 crows. While the Roy simulation allowed a piece of Morty to build a life where Rick had to negotiate rather than assume loyalty. Fear. No Mort gathers those pressures into one experience. Morty wants proof that Rick considers him unique in a universe filled with other Mortys and endless possible partners. The Hole offers that proof through fake Rick, and Morty escapes by refusing it. He eventually emerges from the Hole alone and finds the real Rick still outside. The sight of Rick is not enough for Morty to trust that the experience has ended, because the Hole has already produced convincing copies of ordinary life. Morty therefore performs one final test through conversation and asks whether he is irreplaceable, giving the real Rick a chance to provide the same perfect reassurance the Hole created. Rick responds with the kind of emotional resistance Morty recognizes. The answer is less comforting and more believable, which lets Morty know he is actually back because the real Rick fails to give him the response he would prefer. That small exchange is one of Morty's smartest moments because he verifies reality using a human pattern rather than technology. The real Rick passes the test by behaving imperfectly in exactly the way Morty's evidence predicts. Morty has learned that the answer he dislikes can be more trustworthy than the answer designed to calm him. Morty then warns Rick not to enter the Hole. He knows enough about the experience to understand that Rick could encounter material connected to Diane if he went inside. But Morty does not use that knowledge to pressure Rick into proving anything. After Morty leaves, Rick approaches the opening and considers what he has heard. He chooses not to enter and instead places Morty's photograph on the wall, honoring the people who completed the challenge. The gesture gives Morty recognition only after Morty is gone, which means Morty's escape did not depend on receiving the approval first. That ending protects the contradiction between them. Morty was correct that the perfect version of Rick was false, while the real Rick can still feel pride, affection, or respect without expressing it in the form Morty wanted. Morty's success here is especially revealing because he has almost no external tool to credit. The fear hole controls the environment, Rick's inventions are absent, and the real Rick never enters. Morty's escape depends on observation, memory, and the willingness to reject a satisfying explanation when the evidence does not fit. The reasoning resembles a simple form of falsification. Morty has a belief he wants to keep, which is that the reassuring Rick is real. Years of evidence about Rick's behavior contradict that belief, and Morty follows the contradiction instead of the comfort. That is a harder form of intelligence than noticing a broken machine because emotional desire is working against the correct answer. Morty has to admit that the person saying exactly what he wants is less believable than the person who would frustrate him. Morty's escape does not prove that he permanently solves his relationship with Rick. Later stories continue showing insecurity, anger, dependence, and bad decisions. The fear hole gives Morty one major victory over a fear, without rewriting him into a completely secure person. The lasting development lies in what the episode proves he can do. Morty can enter a reality-bending trap by himself, lose track of which layer is real, and recover by using what he knows about another person without understanding how the whole is engineered. That makes the episode a strong echo of the first section. Vindicators 3 showed Morty studying drunk Rick because survival required it. Fear No Mort shows the same long observation becoming precise enough to identify an emotional counterfeit. Morty leaves without the perfect promise he once wanted and accepts a less comforting version of the relationship because it matches the evidence he knows. The photograph Rick places on the wall adds affection without undoing that lesson because Morty never sees Rick place it and has already walked away without demanding proof. Morty entered assuming Rick would eventually understand the impossible situation better than he could. He leaves after discovering that Rick was never there and that the final useful observation belonged to Morty himself. His smartest move is distrusting an answer designed around his deepest wish. Years of living beside Rick have taught him enough about the real man that even a perfect imitation becomes suspicious when it tries too hard to make him feel safe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Morty escapes one artificial reality by noticing that its version of Rick is wrong, but Rick later creates an artificial life on purpose and leaves Morty inside it for 17 years. This time, Morty comes out carrying skills, memories, and trauma from an entire adulthood, and some of what he learned can be turned directly back on Rick. Section 9. Morty turns Rick's own simulation against him. Summer of all fears. Morty usually learns from Rick's adventures one disaster at a time, then returns home still looking like the same 14-year-old. Rick's punishment for a stolen phone charger gives Morty 17 years of adult experience inside a simulation and lets him keep those memories when he wakes. This is the story of what happens when years of skill, survival, and trauma suddenly exist inside Morty's teenage body. Summer of All Fears opens Season 8 on May 25, 2025. The episode initially follows older versions of Morty and Summer living inside a strange society shaped around chargers, power, scarcity, and the systems needed to keep technology working. The world feels like another distant science fiction setting until Morty and Summer carry out an escape and wake inside their teenage bodies. Their adult lives were part of a simulation Rick created as punishment for taking his phone charger, and because Rick fell asleep while the program was running, Morty and Summer experienced the equivalent of 17 years before they were released. The punishment, therefore, creates something much larger than a lesson about respecting Rick's property. Morty has lived through an entire extra stretch of adulthood. He remembers work, conflict, prison, military service, friendship, loss, and practical skills developed over years. His body is 14 again, but the memories belong to someone with 17 additional years of experience. Morty returns to the same age he was before the simulation while carrying knowledge shaped by an adult life. That creates an unusual problem for the family. Rick sees a 14-year-old standing there and knows Morty remembers years Rick did not personally witness. The normal hierarchy between adult inventor and teenage sidekick becomes less stable because Morty has acquired experiences that cannot be reduced to another afternoon adventure. Rick's first instinct is to solve the problem through mind-blower technology. He can erase what happened and return Morty and Summer to versions of themselves who do not remember the artificial adulthood. Beth objects because Rick created the experience without their consent and would be deciding which parts of their minds they are allowed to keep. Morty and Summer initially choose to keep the memories, creating a rare version of Morty who has access to knowledge accumulated over a long adult life. The change becomes visible almost immediately when he interacts with Rick's equipment. Rick is working around a death race vehicle when Morty notices a problem with the struts and identifies a practical issue with the design. He also understands the kind of terrain the vehicle may face and recommends adding an engine snorkel so it can continue operating through water. Rick is impressed because the normal Morty would not be expected to contribute that kind of mechanical judgment. The moment provides unusually direct evidence that Morty's competence grows as his experience grows. No machine has raised an intelligence score. The 17 years simply gave him enough time to learn skills his ordinary teenage life had never allowed him to develop. Morty does not present the struts or snorkel as mysterious flashes of inspiration either. They are ordinary practical knowledge from his adult life, which makes the scene stronger evidence for learned intelligence than a moment where he simply guesses correctly. Rick's reaction confirms that the contribution has real value inside Rick's own technical environment. Morty still did not design the death race vehicle from nothing. He recognizes a mechanical problem and knows a practical solution, because the simulated years gave him contact with situations where those details mattered. That difference keeps Rick's scientific advantage intact while still showing how much more useful Morty becomes with additional experience. Rick likes that version of him at first. A Morty who can talk about mechanical problems and understand practical design feels closer to an experienced partner than to a nervous child, and Morty receives the kind of recognition he has repeatedly wanted. The problem is that the 17 years produced much more than useful skills. Morty's simulated adulthood included prison and a brutal war. He remembers comrades who died and carries habits formed in environments where survival depended on violence. CJ and the other people connected to Morty's military history give those memories human weight. His practical ability came from years that hurt him, which means Rick cannot simply enjoy the improved Morty without dealing with what created the improvement. The relationship between skill and damage becomes central because Rick's adventures have always taught Morty through danger, and the simulation compresses that process into 17 artificial years. Morty becomes more capable because he has lived longer, and he also becomes more troubled because those extra years included experiences a child should never have been forced to carry. The memories begin affecting how he sees reality. After living inside a fake world for 17 years, Morty no longer accepts ordinary surroundings as automatic proof that he escaped. The fear hole had already taught him that an apparent return to normal can be another layer, and Rick has now deliberately created a similar uncertainty as punishment. Morty starts suspecting the world around him could still be part of another simulation. That suspicion grows into planning because Morty no longer wants Rick to be the only person capable of deciding which reality is real. His adult memories include technical and tactical knowledge from the simulated war, so Morty begins using that knowledge without telling Rick everything he is preparing. The shift makes the section different from his portal crisis with Nick. Morty improvised against Nick because an immediate threat forced him to act. Here he plans in advance because experience has taught him not to trust the environment, which shows how the same lesson that makes him harder to fool can also make ordinary reality harder to accept. Morty's suspicion is useful and dangerous at the same time. He is better prepared for another artificial world because he has survived one, yet the possibility of deception now shapes his behavior even without proof that another simulation exists. His later trap, therefore, grows from experience rather than from a desire to show off. After 17 years inside a world Rick created without consent, Morty is willing to use control over perceived reality against the person who taught him how powerful it can be. Morty eventually turns the structure of Rick's punishment back on him by trapping Rick inside another Matrix-style simulation. After containing Rick, Morty steals the death race vehicle and begins carrying out a plan of his own. The reversal is the section's clearest genius moment because Rick created the original Matrix to control Morty and Summer, while Morty emerges with enough practical knowledge to use the same basic method against Rick. The student has taken a lesson nobody intended to teach and turned it into a countermeasure. The plan requires several kinds of ability working together. Morty needs technical knowledge, patience, memory, and the confidence to act without Rick's approval. 17 years have made him less willing to accept that Rick defines reality simply because he usually understands the machinery. Once Rick is trapped, Morty drives toward Power Plant Valley, and his plan becomes much larger and more dangerous than proving he can outsmart his grandfather. The adult memories and war trauma are now influencing what Morty considers a reasonable response, so the competence that impressed Rick in the garage becomes part of a threat. The death race vehicle reaches defenses meant to stop it, including a moat. The earlier snorkel suggestion now becomes part of the escalation, because the modification Morty calmly recommended allows the stolen vehicle to continue operating through water. That callback makes Morty's practical intelligence visible in two different contexts. Rick appreciates the suggestion when Morty is improving the vehicle for him, while the same improvement becomes dangerous once Morty's goals stop matching Rick's. The knowledge has not changed, the person deciding how to use it has. Summer's adult life inside the simulation also developed different skills. She became good at understanding the larger system and building power within it, while Morty gained experience through labor, imprisonment, combat, and survival. They lived in the same matrix but learned different things because they occupied different positions inside it. That difference becomes important when Summer reveals facts about the war that Morty did not fully understand from his own point of view. Morty remembers fighting, losing people, and being used as a military asset, while Summer remembers political and resource decisions that helped create the conflict. Inside the simulated society, Summer learned how the system worked and rose in power. The civilization depended on resources connected to the charger economy, including lithium, and her choices contributed to a war Morty experienced from the ground. Morty's dead friends and combat memories were therefore connected to decisions Summer made while building her own position. The reveal changes the emotional target because Morty has spent much of the episode directing his anger toward Rick. Rick created the punishment and later enjoyed the adult skills it produced, but Summer was trapped too and still used Morty's abilities during their years inside. That confrontation adds another layer to Morty's intelligence because he receives new information at the moment he is most committed to his plan. He has enough tactical ability to keep moving toward the power infrastructure, but Summer gives him context that changes what continuing would mean. Morty has to decide whether being capable of finishing the attack is still a reason to finish it. The Death Crystal story showed Morty refusing to reconsider a goal while the system kept rewarding his progress. Here he is eventually willing to let new information change the goal, which shows a different kind of adaptability from simply changing tactics. Summer eventually stops trying to control Morty and gives him a real choice about what he wants. Morty chooses to go home rather than continue the attack. That decision matters because the episode has spent so much time proving the 17 years made him more capable. He finally recognizes that keeping all of those experiences is not worth what they are doing to him. The story returns to Rick's mind-blower technology, and Morty and Summer agree to let the adult memories go, restoring the younger versions who can return to their ordinary lives. The reset separates temporary knowledge from the skills Morty developed across his real adventures. The mechanical expertise and military experience gained during the 17 simulated years are deliberately removed. The series does not need to treat Morty as permanently 31 years old inside a 14-year-old body. His real adventures are different because those experiences remain part of the Morty who continues after the memory wipe. Rick cannot erase every lesson from Vindicators 3, the Morphizer, the Death Crystal, the Portal Accident, the Fear Hole, and all the smaller experiences between them without erasing years of Morty's actual life. Summer of All Fears therefore works like an exaggerated experiment. Give Morty 17 extra years, and his practical ability grows enough for Rick to notice immediately. He becomes mechanically useful, tactically dangerous, and capable of preparing a plan that traps Rick inside the same type of control system Rick used on him. The cost rises alongside the skill because Morty also carries combat memories, grief, and the instincts of someone who spent years surviving environments a teenager should never know. Rick initially sees the increased competence and enjoys having a more capable partner, while the rest of the episode forces him to face what those abilities cost. The connection is more specific than simply saying an older Morty is smarter. Experience gives him knowledge, while trauma shapes how he uses the knowledge. The Matrix reversal also changes the balance between Rick and Morty without pretending Morty has surpassed Rick scientifically. Rick still built the original punishment and still has the technology needed to erase its effects. Morty no longer needs to beat Rick at invention in order to catch him because he can use planning, memory, and learned familiarity with Rick's methods. The small snorkel modification is the best object to leave behind because it carries the whole section's progression. Morty notices a practical problem, suggests a useful fix, and earns Rick's respect. Later, that same modification helps Morty defeat a defense while driving the vehicle against Rick's interests. That detail mirrors the larger danger of Morty's development. Every skill he learns beside Rick can eventually become something he uses without Rick. And Rick may like the result when Morty's goals match his own, while hating it when Morty decides the same lesson applies in the opposite direction. Morty ultimately chooses to lose the 17 years rather than keep becoming the person those years created. The series returns him to 14, but the episode has already shown what concentrated experience can do. Enough time inside dangerous systems can turn Morty from the child trapped in Rick's matrix into the person capable of putting Rick inside one. The memory wipe removes the artificial adulthood, yet it cannot remove the broader direction established across the series. Morty keeps accumulating real experience every time Rick places him near a new disaster, and Summer of All Fears simply makes that process visible at an exaggerated speed. Morty begins the episode as the person being punished and reaches the point where Rick has to escape a punishment Morty created from the lesson. The reversal never makes Morty the better scientist. It makes him an experienced enough student to understand that Rick's methods can work in both directions, which becomes an important bridge into the final section where Morty no longer needs a machine to reverse one of Rick's habits against him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Rick can erase 17 artificial years, but he cannot erase every lesson Morty learned during his real life beside him. By the Season 9 finale, Morty is stranded with a Rick who escaped drinking, portal science, and the old family pattern, forcing Morty to solve the system he has studied longer than any machine, Rick himself. Section 10. Morty learns how to control a Rick. Field of Dreams. Morty has spent years relying on Rick's portal science whenever an adventure leaves him somewhere he cannot escape. Funeral hopping strands him with a Smith family whose own Rick walked away from interdimensional science, became sober, and built a different life. This is the story of Morty trying to get home when the only Rick available has strong reasons to avoid becoming the person Morty needs. Field of Dreams aired on July 26, 2026, as the Season 9 finale. The story begins with Morty at an interdimensional estate sale after another Smith family has died. There he meets another Morty and learns about funeral hopping, a practice built around visiting realities where a version of Morty has died. Portal Jr. devices let these Mortys enter worlds where another Morty has died and temporarily receive the grief, affection, and attention left behind. Morty tries it and reaches a universe where the local Morty, known as Mort by his family, has died. The Smiths react with shock because they do not live with the same casual understanding of alternate realities that Morty does. But once he explains enough for them to accept what he is, the family welcomes him. That reception gives Morty something his own home rarely provides in such a concentrated form. This family misses their Morty and treats his presence as meaningful because he resembles the person they lost. Alternate Jerry becomes especially important. Morty's own father cares about him, but Rick often dominates the family and makes Jerry look weak beside him. In this universe, Jerry built his life without Rick occupying the center of every decision. He gives Morty direct attention and behaves like the involved father Morty often wishes he had. And Morty responds because the household treats his safety as something worth protecting rather than as an obstacle to another adventure. The warmth makes staying attractive before the family's grief begins, changing what they want from him. Morty tells them stories about the kinds of situations he has survived, including experiences where death has become almost casual because Rick can sometimes undo it. The alternate Smiths are disturbed because their Morty died permanently. Adventures Morty treats as normal sound horrifying to a family that has lived with the finality Rick's science often removes from his life. Their reaction lets Morty see his normal existence through people who do not share Rick's standards. They hear a 14-year-old describing repeated death, danger, and impossible trauma as part of an ordinary childhood, and their concern makes the household feel safer and more caring than the one Morty knows. The comfort becomes complicated as Jerry's grief begins shaping how he treats Morty. He wants to protect this replacement from the kind of loss he already suffered, but the protection grows controlling. Jerry pushes Morty through harsh outdoor survival expectations and wants him to take on dangerous physical challenges because his fear of losing another son has become tied to making this Morty stronger. The family also wants Morty to stay permanently, so a visit meant to borrow another family's affection begins turning into a plan to fill the place their Morty left behind. Morty is not their Mort, yet everyone has reasons to treat him as though the empty space can be repaired if he agrees to remain. Jerry eventually pressures Morty to destroy the Portal Jr. During an emotional exchange, Morty does it and cuts off the easiest route back to his own universe. The choice gives the alternate family what they wanted and immediately changes Morty's position because he is no longer a visitor who can leave when the situation becomes uncomfortable. Morty recognizes that the loving household has become another trap and runs away. Morty is recognizing that affection can become another form of control when the people offering it need him to replace someone he is not. Without the small portal device, getting home requires the kind of science only a Rick is likely to provide. Morty finds this universe's Rick and discovers someone radically different from the grandfather he knows. Professor Sanchez has been sober for 17 years, attends Alcoholics Anonymous, teaches at a university, has remarried a woman named Uli, and describes himself as happy. He has also abandoned serious portal research because that work belonged to a period of his life connected to alcohol, obsession, and the damage that separated him from the Smith family. Morty's practical problem is simple to understand and difficult to solve. He needs portal travel from a man whose healthier life depends on staying away from portal travel. Professor Sanchez initially refuses because he understands where that research once took him and does not want to return. Morty cannot steal a finished portal gun because there is no finished portal gun waiting for him, and he cannot build one himself because the science remains beyond him. The only available path home is to persuade this Rick to become interested in a problem the man deliberately left behind. That requirement changes Morty's role completely. He has spent years learning to operate around Rick's science, but now he has to work on the scientist. Morty starts with information he knows matters to Rick's by talking about Diane and explaining what he has learned from living across alternate realities. He tells Professor Sanchez that Diane's disappearance was not his personal failure in the simple way this Rick may have carried it, and he describes how other Ricks approached portal development. Morty also points toward the possibility that the problem can still be solved, giving the professor a reason to see the abandoned research as unfinished rather than safely closed. Morty does believe this Rick is capable, but he also needs the man to believe in that capability strongly enough to reopen a part of his life he closed for a reason. Morty understands that pride and scientific challenge are powerful forces for a Rick. His own Rick has spent years reacting to doubt as though every challenge is a demand for proof, and Morty has watched arguments become inventions simply because Rick wanted to prove he could solve the problem. Those observations now become a strategy rather than a warning. Professor Sanchez begins returning to the research. At first, the change can look like productive excitement because Morty has brought him a difficult problem and information from outside his universe. The work becomes more consuming as Rick struggles to recreate the science he once abandoned. Uli sees the change from a different position. She knows the sober husband who built routines, attended meetings, taught students, and stayed away from the obsessive life that damaged him before. Morty knows another version of Rick, the version who can treat ordinary limits as obstacles once a scientific problem becomes personal. Those two kinds of knowledge collide around Professor Sanchez. Uli sees warning signs because the behavior is moving away from the stable person she knows, while Morty sees the same movement as progress toward the Rick who can get him home. Morty continues encouraging the research, and the encouragement becomes harder to separate from pressure. He uses what he knows about Rick's grief, pride, intelligence, and desire to solve problems other people cannot solve. Uli eventually confronts Morty because she recognizes what the process is doing to her husband and sees a 14-year-old applying pressure with a level of familiarity that does not look accidental. When she questions where Morty learned to handle someone like this, the answer leads back to Rick. That connection gives the entire video its darkest callback because Morty learned to read drunk Rick for survival. He learned which subjects became obsessions, which criticisms triggered pride, and which emotional wounds Rick protected with arrogance. Those observations once helped Morty survive traps and bombs. In this universe, the same observations help him create the conditions he needs. The skill stays the same while Morty's goal changes. He needs portal travel, and the person capable of giving it to him has built a healthy life around refusing the path that produces it. Morty keeps rewarding the traits that move Professor Sanchez closer to the version of Rick he understands. Morty has no machine controlling Rick's mind. He uses conversation, information, encouragement, and pressure, while the decisions still belong to Professor Sanchez. Morty's intelligence appears in choosing which parts of Rick's personality to activate and knowing how those parts tend to respond. He cannot build the portal, but he can make the challenge increasingly difficult for a Rick to ignore. The relapse makes the cost impossible to miss. Professor Sanchez begins drinking again after 17 years of sobriety. His research consumes more of his life, and the stability around his marriage and routines begins breaking down. The portal problem becomes more important to him than the limits he previously used to protect himself. Morty watches the transformation because getting home still depends on the result, which makes his success uncomfortable long before the machine works. He lacks the portal science needed to build the doorway himself. His advantage is understanding a Rick well enough to keep moving the scientist toward the state where building it becomes possible. Professor Sanchez eventually succeeds in creating portal travel, and Morty has gotten what he needed. The success is the strongest high point because the route to it was psychological rather than scientific. Rick remains the person who can build the impossible machine. Morty's contribution is changing the environment around the scientist until the work happens. Morty even asks whether he has ruined Rick's life, and by then, the newly relapsed Professor Sanchez sees his priorities differently and treats the return to portal science as liberation rather than damage. The response shows how far the man has moved from the sober professor. The alternate Smith family arrives before Morty can leave cleanly. Their grief, Jerry's controlling behavior, and Rick's relapse collide in one place, and the confrontation becomes catastrophic. Members of the family die as the situation collapses. Morty gets access to the portal he wanted, but the alternate household that welcomed him no longer survives as the safe family he first entered. The reality later becomes another Smith family estate sale, closing a circle the episode began before Morty knew any of these people. He first learned about funeral hopping while strangers claimed possessions left behind by a dead Smith family, and his visit eventually helps create another dead household whose remaining objects can be treated the same way. Creator commentary after the finale supports focusing on how years with Rick have changed Morty. The story places him in a situation where habits learned from Rick are used to influence another Rick because Morty wants something badly enough. He still needs Rick-level science to open the portal. His learned advantage is knowing how a Rick reacts to grief, pride, doubt, and obsession, a different kind of intelligence that still grows from the same long exposure. Morty has spent years watching Rick under pressure because survival often depended on understanding what Rick would do next. By the Season 9 finale, that knowledge can be used offensively. Morty no longer needs to wait for Rick's behavior and react. He can create pressure in places where he knows the behavior is likely to change. The result is darker since Professor Sanchez began as evidence that a Rick could live differently. He had sobriety, work, a marriage, and distance from the obsession that defines many other versions, while Morty's escape route requires pulling those old traits back into the center of his life. Morty reaches his own Rick again. After the alternate family, Jerry, the sober professor, the relapse, and the deaths, he no longer wants another funeral hopping experience. He wants to go home. Morty also expresses love toward Rick, and Rick responds awkwardly rather than giving the perfect emotional reassurance Morty might once have demanded. That detail quietly connects back to Fear No Mort, because Morty already learned that a Rick who gives him exactly the emotional answer he wants can feel less real than the difficult person he actually knows. He can return to that imperfect relationship after seeing what happened when he pushed another Rick toward the version he needed. The ending does not erase Morty's responsibility or turn the alternate disaster into a permanent moral transformation. Morty can still be selfish, frightened, manipulative, brave, and wrong. What Field of Dreams adds is a final form of competence. Morty has learned enough about Rick that the knowledge can function almost like another tool. He understands which wounds, needs, and challenges can move a Rick toward obsession, and once portal travel becomes the goal, Morty applies that knowledge until a healthier Rick begins behaving more like the version Morty already knows. The estate sale is the best object to leave behind because Morty begins by treating another family's death as a doorway into affection and ends after watching another household become the same kind of abandoned inventory. The circle makes the cost of his strategy visible without needing a speech to explain it. Morty starts this video surviving a drunken neutrino bomb because he knows Rick's habits, and he ends it using that same long education to push a sober Rick toward building the technology Morty needs. Across these 10 stories, Morty's intelligence grows through the situations Rick makes normal. A drunken neutrino bomb teaches him Rick's patterns, while the morphizer teaches him to learn from a machine. Detoxing reveals social skill hidden under fear, and the death crystal shows how quickly he can adjust to feedback. The save point remote exposes the limit of a clever idea without full technical knowledge, while the portal in his hand forces him to improvise. Marta reveals leadership. The fear hole turns knowledge of Rick into a reality check, and 17 simulated years show how quickly experience can deepen Morty's skills. By Field of Dreams, the same education has reached Rick's psychology. Rick remains the stronger scientist. Morty has become unusually good at surviving, reading, and sometimes controlling the world Rick trained him to live in. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.